Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The radio crackled to life at 11:47 p.m., cutting through the humid silence that had settled over Precinct 19 like a suffocating blanket made of equal parts summer heat and urban decay. Officer Sarah Chen had been staring at the coffee-stained incident reports on her metal desk for the past 47 minutes, fighting off the familiar drowsiness that came with working the graveyard shift in one of Detroit's most forgotten neighborhoods, when dispatch delivered the call that would transform her understanding of evil and forever change how she viewed the darkness that consumed the city after midnight, like a living, breathing predator. Unit 47, we have a welfare check at 1247 Corktown Avenue, apartment 3B. Landlord reports foul odor coming from the unit. Tenant hasn't been seen in over a week. No answer at the door. Requesting patrol response for preliminary investigation. Chen grabbed her radio with one hand and her keys with the other, grateful for something, anything, to break the monotony of another slow Tuesday night in August 2023. The graveyard shift in Precinct 19 was usually filled with domestic disputes that erupted in the suffocating heat, drunk and disorderly calls from the few bars that still operated in the area, and the occasional break-in at one of the abandoned buildings that dotted the landscape, like broken teeth in a diseased mouth. Welfare checks were routine, usually elderly residents who had died alone in apartments that hadn't seen a maintenance worker in years, their bodies discovered days or weeks later by concerned neighbors or landlords worried about unpaid rent checks that never arrived. Chen had worked the night shift for 3 years since graduating from the police academy, long enough to develop the 1,000-yard stare that came with seeing too much human misery concentrated in too small an area. She had chosen the graveyard shift partly for the pay differential. Night shift officers earned an extra 15%, but mostly because she preferred the honesty of the darkness. During the day, Detroit's problems could be hidden behind the bustling activity of commerce and the optimistic rhetoric of urban renewal. But at night, when the honest citizens locked their doors and drew their curtains, the city revealed its true nature, predatory, desperate, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. But as Chen drove through the empty streets toward Corktown Avenue, something felt different about this call. The neighborhood, which during daylight hours showed signs of the urban renewal efforts that were slowly transforming Detroit from post-industrial wasteland to gentrified playground for young professionals, took on a sinister quality after dark. Abandoned lots created black voids between flickering streetlights that cast harsh shadows and left vast areas in complete darkness. The few occupied buildings seemed to huddle together for protection against the darkness that pressed in from all sides like a physical presence. Chen's patrol car, a 2019 Ford Police Interceptor with over 150,000 miles on the odometer, and a persistent rattle that suggested imminent mechanical failure, navigated the pothole-riddled streets with the careful precision of someone who had learned to read the city's moods through the vibrations transmitted through the steering wheel. The radio chatter was sparse. Precinct 19 on a Tuesday night rarely generated enough activity to keep dispatchers busy, but Chen could hear the underlying tension in the voices of her colleagues as they dealt with the routine chaos that emerged from the city's shadows after dark. 1247 Corktown Avenue was a 3-story brick building that had seen better decades, its facade marked by water stains from a leaking roof, missing mortar that gave it the appearance of a diseased tooth, and windows covered with plywood or secured with steel bars that proclaimed the building's surrender to urban decay. The building housed 6 apartments divided among 3 floors, and according to the call notes, the complaint concerned the unit on the 3rd floor, where a tenant named Marcus Williams had lived alone for the past 2 years without incident. Chen met the landlord, Albert Kowalski, in the dimly lit lobby that smelled of industrial disinfectant and human desperation. Kowalski was a thin, nervous man in his 60s who had been managing rental properties in the area for over 20 years, long enough to develop the haunted expression that came with dealing with Detroit's housing crisis on a daily basis. He wore a Detroit Tigers baseball cap that had seen better seasons and a windbreaker despite the oppressive heat, as if preparing for weather conditions that existed only in his anxious mind. "Officer, thank you for coming so quickly," Kowalski said, his voice carrying the weight of too many similar discoveries over the years. "I've been in this business for 2 decades and I know that smell. But this one's different somehow, stronger, like it's been building for longer than it should have." Kowalski led Chen up the narrow staircase, his keys jangling with each step as he explained the situation in a voice that cracked with nervous energy. The building's interior was better maintained than its exterior suggested, but the hallways were still marked by the casual violence of urban poverty. Scuff marks on the walls, doors reinforced with multiple locks, and the kind of industrial carpeting that could hide stains and withstand punishment. Marcus was a good tenant, Kowalski continued as they climbed toward the 3rd floor, his breathing becoming labored as they ascended. Quiet, always paid his rent on time, never caused any trouble with the other residents. That's why I got worried when I didn't see him for over a week. He usually picks up his mail every day, but his box has been full for 8 days now. Then, yesterday, Mrs. Rodriguez in 3A started complaining about the smell. The odor hit Chen as soon as they reached the 3rd floor landing. It was unmistakable, the sweet, cloying scent of human decomposition that every police officer learned to recognize early in their career, a smell that seemed to coat the inside of your nostrils and linger in your memory long after exposure. But there was something else mixed with it, something chemical and artificial that Chen couldn't immediately identify. It reminded her of the cleaning supplies used in hospitals, but with an underlying metallic tang that suggested something more sinister. Kowalski unlocked the door to apartment 3B with hands that shook slightly. Whether from age or anxiety, Chen couldn't determine. He stepped back as the smell intensified, pulling his windbreaker up over his nose in a futile attempt to block the odor. Chen pulled on latex gloves from her duty belt and activated her body camera before entering the apartment, following standard procedure for potential death investigations that had been drilled into her during academy training. What she found inside would challenge every assumption she had about routine welfare checks and force her to confront the reality that some evil hides in the most ordinary places, disguised as normalcy and respectability. The apartment was immaculate. Not just clean, but organized with an obsessive precision that immediately set off alarm bells in Chen's mind. Books were arranged by height on shelves that showed no dust accumulation. Canned goods in the kitchen were lined up with military precision with their labels facing forward, and every surface gleamed as if it had been recently sanitized with professional-grade cleaning products. This wasn't the home of someone who had died of natural causes and been discovered days later by concerned neighbors. The living room was furnished with a brown leather couch that showed no signs of wear, a coffee table positioned exactly in the center of the room, and a flat-screen television mounted on the wall at precise eye level. A small bookshelf held volumes on philosophy, psychology, and medical texts that seemed out of place for a bus driver. The kitchen was equally pristine, with appliances that appeared to have been recently cleaned and organized with the kind of attention to detail typically associated with professional food service. Chen documented the scene with her body camera, while noting details that would later prove crucial to the investigation. The apartment's cleanliness wasn't just unusual, it was actively disturbing. This level of organization suggested either obsessive-compulsive disorder or deliberate staging, and Chen's training told her that staging usually indicated criminal activity. Marcus Williams was found in the bedroom, lying on his back on top of the bed covers, fully dressed in a clean white shirt and dark pants that appeared to have been recently pressed. His hands were folded across his chest in the manner of funeral home preparation, and his eyes had been closed with the kind of care typically reserved for professional morticians. At first glance, it looked like he had died peacefully in his sleep, but Chen's training and instincts told her something was very wrong with the scene. The body showed no obvious signs of trauma, no bullet wounds, stab marks, or evidence of blunt force injury. But the lack of decomposition, despite the smell that had prompted the welfare check, suggested that Williams had died more recently than the week-long absence would indicate. More disturbing was the evidence of post-mortem care. Someone had clearly tended to the body after death, cleaning and positioning it with the kind of attention typically reserved for funeral home preparation. Chen called for backup and requested a supervisor while she secured the scene and began documenting the unusual circumstances. As she waited for additional units to arrive, she conducted a preliminary search of the apartment that revealed details that transformed the welfare check into a potential homicide investigation. In the kitchen, she found a calendar with the past week's dates marked with small red X's, as if someone had been keeping track of time since Williams's death. The handwriting was neat and precise, suggesting someone with educational background or professional training. A notebook on the counter contained detailed schedules written in the same careful script, but the handwriting didn't match the penmanship on other documents bearing Williams' name that Chen found scattered throughout the apartment. Most unsettling was a stack of photographs she discovered in a drawer next to the refrigerator. The photos showed Williams in various locations around the apartment, apparently taken without his knowledge over a period of several weeks. The images captured him eating breakfast, watching television, reading in bed, and performing other intimate activities that suggested the photographer had been conducting surveillance for an extended period. The photographs were taken from angles that suggested the photographer had been inside the apartment, but there was no indication of how someone could have gained access to conduct such extensive surveillance without Williams' knowledge. The images were time-stamped with a digital camera, and the progression showed Williams' daily routine over a period of at least 6 weeks leading up to his death. Sergeant Martinez arrived 20 minutes later, his patrol car's emergency lights casting red and blue patterns on the building's facade. Martinez was a 15-year veteran of the Detroit Police Department who had worked his way up from patrol officer to shift supervisor through a combination of competence, dedication, and the kind of political savvy that allowed survival in a department plagued by budget cuts and staffing shortages. Following Martinez was Detective Rodriguez from the Homicide Unit, summoned by the unusual circumstances Chen had reported over the radio. Rodriguez was a 20-year veteran who had seen every type of death the city could produce, from domestic violence murders to drug-related executions to the random violence that erupted from urban poverty like a malignant cancer. But even he was unsettled by the meticulous arrangement of the crime scene and the evidence of prolonged surveillance that had preceded Williams's death. "This isn't random," Rodriguez told Chen as they examined the photographs together in the apartment's living room. "Someone's been watching Williams for weeks, maybe months. These pictures show him eating, sleeping, watching TV, intimate moments when he thought he was alone and secure in his own home. Whoever did this wanted to know every detail of his routine before they made their move." Rodriguez had worked hundreds of homicide cases during his career, but the Williams scene was unlike anything in his experience. The level of planning and preparation suggested a killer with sophisticated knowledge of surveillance techniques and access to professional-grade equipment. The post-mortem care indicated someone with medical training or funeral industry experience. Most disturbing was the evidence that the killer had spent weeks studying the victim before committing the murder. The investigation that followed would reveal that Marcus Williams had been a city bus driver for the Detroit Department of Transportation, working the early morning shift that brought him home by mid-afternoon every day. He was described by neighbors and co-workers as quiet and reliable, someone who went to work, came home, and kept to himself without causing problems for anyone around him. He had no known enemies, no history of trouble with the law, and no apparent connection to criminal activity that might explain why someone would target him for such an elaborate killing. Williams's supervisor at the bus depot, a 25-year DPD veteran named Frank Morrison, described him as one of their most dependable drivers. Marcus never missed a shift, never had complaints from passengers, never caused any trouble, Morrison told Detective Rodriguez during the initial interview. He was the kind of employee you could set your watch by. Same routine every day. Clock in at 5 a.m., drive his route, clock out at 2 p.m., go home. I can't imagine why anyone would want to hurt him. The autopsy performed by the Wayne County Medical Examiner revealed that Williams had died from asphyxiation. But the method was so subtle that it had required sophisticated knowledge of human anatomy to execute without leaving obvious evidence. Dr. Patricia Kim, the chief medical examiner, discovered a tiny puncture wound in Williams' neck, barely visible even under magnification, that had been used to inject a paralytic agent that rendered him unable to breathe while leaving him conscious and aware of what was happening to him. Whoever did this has extensive medical training. Dr. Kim explained to the investigation team during the autopsy briefing. The injection site was perfectly placed to avoid major blood vessels while ensuring rapid distribution of the paralytic agent throughout the nervous system. The victim would have been unable to move or call for help, but remained conscious and aware until oxygen deprivation caused death. It's a cruel and sophisticated method of murder that requires knowledge of human anatomy and pharmacology. The toxicology report identified the paralytic as succinylcholine, a drug commonly used in medical procedures to induce temporary paralysis during surgery, but strictly controlled due to its potential for abuse and its history of use in murders designed to appear natural. The fact that the killer had access to this highly regulated substance narrowed the suspect pool to individuals with medical training or connections to healthcare facilities, but also suggested a level of premeditation that made the crime particularly disturbing. Dr. Kim's examination also revealed evidence that Williams had been kept alive for several minutes after the injection, conscious but unable to move or speak while the killer performed some kind of ritual or ceremony. Trace evidence suggested that Williams had been positioned and repositioned multiple times after the paralytic took effect, as if the killer had been experimenting with different arrangements or simply enjoying the power of controlling another human being. As the investigation progressed, Chen found herself assigned as the primary liaison between patrol officers and the detective unit, a role that required her to coordinate with other precincts and compile information about similar cases that might be connected to Williams' murder. The assignment was both an honor, recognition of her investigative instincts in recognizing the suspicious nature of the scene, and a burden that would consume her life for the next several months. What she discovered during her research would transform a single homicide into one of the most complex serial killer investigations in Detroit's history. Over the next 2 weeks, working through databases and cold case files during her off-duty hours, Chen identified 3 other cases in different precincts that shared disturbing similarities with the Williams murder. In each case, a solitary individual living alone had been found dead in their home, positioned with the same meticulous care and showing evidence of prolonged surveillance before their death. The victims were all employed in public service jobs: a postal worker, a librarian, and a sanitation worker, and all had been described as quiet, reliable people who followed predictable routines without deviation. The connection between the cases had been missed because they occurred in different precincts over a period of 8 months, and were initially classified as natural deaths or potential suicides by investigators who lacked the comparative information needed to recognize the pattern. It wasn't until Chen began systematically comparing autopsy reports and crime scene photographs that the connections became clear and undeniable. Each victim had died from the same paralytic injection administered in the same location on the neck. Each had been positioned identically after death, with hands folded across the chest and eyes closed in funeral home fashion. Each had been the subject of extended surveillance documented in photographs found at their homes, and each lived alone without close family or social connections that would lead to quick discovery of their deaths. Detective Rodriguez formed a task force that included representatives from all affected precincts, with Chen serving as the coordinator for patrol-level intelligence gathering and database research. The task force operated out of a conference room in police headquarters downtown, equipped with computers, evidence boards, and communication equipment that allowed coordination between multiple investigative teams. The task force's analysis revealed that the killer was selecting victims based on specific criteria that made them ideal targets for extended surveillance and delayed discovery. The victims lived alone, followed predictable routines that made surveillance easier, worked in public service positions that suggested reliability and trustworthiness, and had minimal social connections that would lead anyone to notice their absence immediately. "He's hunting invisible people," Rodriguez explained during a briefing with task force members and precinct commanders. "Victims who won't be missed immediately, whose deaths won't generate intense scrutiny, who can be observed and studied without anyone noticing. Unusual activity around their homes. This isn't passion or rage driving these murders, it's systematic predation of the most vulnerable members of our community." The surveillance photographs found at each crime scene revealed the killer's method of victim selection and preparation. The photos showed weeks or months of observation, documenting daily routines, work schedules, and social habits with the thoroughness of a professional intelligence operation. The killer had learned when each victim was home alone, when they received visitors, which was rarely, and when they were most vulnerable to approach without witnesses. But the photographs also provided the first real clue to the killer's identity. Technical analysis by the FBI's forensic laboratory in Quantico revealed that all the photos had been taken with the same camera, a high-end digital model with distinctive lens characteristics and image processing capabilities. More importantly, several photos included reflections in windows, mirrors, or other reflective surfaces that showed a partial view of the photographer. The reflection analysis, enhanced through computer imaging technology originally developed for satellite reconnaissance, revealed a figure wearing medical scrubs and a surgical mask. The body type and posture suggested a male in his 30s or 40s with medical training, confirming the profile developed from the sophisticated injection technique and access to paralytic drugs. Chen coordinated with area hospitals, medical schools, and veterinary clinics to identify potential suspects who matched the profile and had access to succinylcholine. The search focused on individuals who had been terminated or disciplined for inappropriate behavior, those with histories of stalking or voyeuristic crimes, and anyone who had exhibited unusual interest in death or dying during their medical training or practice. The investigation required Chen to work closely with hospital administrators, medical licensing boards, and pharmaceutical companies that manufactured and distributed controlled substances. The process was complicated by privacy laws and professional confidentiality requirements, but the seriousness of the investigation and the involvement of federal authorities helped overcome most bureaucratic obstacles. The breakthrough came when Chen interviewed staff at Detroit General Hospital about missing controlled substances during a routine audit of their pharmacy inventory. A nurse named Janet Phillips mentioned that small amounts of succinylcholine had been disappearing from their supplies over the past 6 months, but the thefts were so minor and sporadic that they had attributed them to inventory errors rather than deliberate theft. "We kept finding shortages in our paralytic supplies," Phillips explained during her interview with Chen and Rodriguez. "Just a vial here and there, never enough to cause problems with patient care, but consistent enough that we started wondering if someone was taking them. The pharmacy director thought it might be accounting errors or expired drugs being discarded without proper documentation." Security footage from the hospital revealed that the missing drugs coincided with the shifts of Dr. Michael Harrison, a resident in emergency medicine who had access to the drug storage areas and the medical knowledge needed to use paralytic agents for criminal purposes. Harrison had been hired 6 months earlier after completing his residency at a hospital in Cleveland, where he had been dismissed for what personnel records described as interpersonal problems and boundary issues that weren't detailed in his employment file. When Chen and Rodriguez obtained Harrison's complete employment history from Cleveland, they discovered a pattern of complaints from female colleagues about inappropriate behavior and unwanted attention. Several nurses had reported feeling like they were being watched or followed, but Harrison's supervisors had attributed the complaints to personality conflicts rather than predatory behavior. His dismissal had been handled quietly to avoid legal complications and professional embarrassment. Harrison lived alone in a downtown apartment that he rarely left except for work, grocery shopping, and what appeared to be surveillance activities in various neighborhoods around the city. His neighbors in the apartment building described him as polite but strange, someone who kept odd hours and seemed to be always watching from his windows when other residents came and went. The task force obtained a search warrant for Harrison's apartment, expecting to find evidence connecting him to the murders and possibly additional victims who hadn't yet been identified. What they discovered exceeded their worst expectations and revealed the true scope of his criminal activities and the depth of his psychological disturbance. Harrison's apartment had been converted into a surveillance center that would have been impressive if it weren't so terrifying. Multiple computer monitors displayed live feeds from hidden cameras he had installed near the homes of over 20 individuals throughout the city. Filing cabinets contained detailed dossiers on each subject, including work schedules, social habits, psychological profiles, and vulnerability assessments that Harrison had compiled through months of meticulous observation. The surveillance equipment was sophisticated and expensive, suggesting that Harrison had invested considerable time and money in his stalking activities. Cameras were concealed in fake utility boxes, abandoned vehicles, and even trees, providing coverage of subjects' homes from multiple angles. Computer systems recorded and analyzed the footage, allowing Harrison to study his target's routines and identify optimal times for approach. But the most disturbing discovery was Harrison's collection of trophies from his victims. He had taken personal items from each murder scene: a coffee mug, a book, a piece of jewelry, a photograph, which he displayed in a shrine-like arrangement in his bedroom. Each trophy was labeled with the victim's name, date of death, and Harrison's observations about their final moments and what he had learned from studying their deaths. Harrison's computer contained hundreds of hours of surveillance footage and thousands of photographs documenting his subjects' daily lives in excruciating detail. He had compiled psychological profiles that included speculation about their fears, desires, and emotional vulnerabilities. Most chilling were his notes about which subjects would make the best research opportunities for his study of solitary death. Harrison's journal, found on his computer in encrypted files that required FBI cybercrime specialists to decode, revealed the psychological framework that had motivated his crimes. He viewed his victims as practice subjects for what he called the study of solitary death, a research project he believed would advance understanding of human psychology and the dying process. "Most people die surrounded by others," Harrison had written in one journal entry. "Family members, medical professionals, clergy, all providing comfort and distraction from the fundamental experience of mortality. My subjects experienced death as it was meant to be experienced, alone, conscious, and without the illusions that society uses to mask the reality of human vulnerability." The journal entries revealed that Harrison selected his victims not randomly, but because their isolated lifestyles made them ideal subjects for his study of what he considered authentic death experiences. He spent months learning their routines, their fears, their personalities, and their social connections before deciding whether they were suitable for what he called his research contributions. Harrison's writing showed evidence of grandiose delusions and a complete lack of empathy for his victims. He viewed the murders not as crimes, but as scientific experiments that would contribute to human knowledge about death and dying. His medical training had provided him with both the technical knowledge needed to kill efficiently and the psychological framework to rationalize murder as research. But Harrison wasn't finished with his experiments. The surveillance cameras revealed that he was actively monitoring 18 more potential victims, with detailed plans for their murders already developed and refined based on his previous experiences. The discovery of this information led to one of the largest protective custody operations in Detroit police history, as officers raced to warn potential victims and remove them from danger. Chen coordinated the victim notification process, working with officers from multiple precincts to locate and warn individuals who appeared in Harrison's surveillance files. The process was complicated by the fact that many potential victims didn't know they were being watched and were skeptical of police warnings about a threat they couldn't see or understand. "We had to convince people that someone they'd never met was planning to murder them based on surveillance they weren't aware of," Chen later recalled. "Some people thought we were crazy. Others were terrified. A few refused protection because they didn't trust the police. It was one of the most challenging aspects of the investigation." The manhunt for Harrison intensified when it became clear that he had disappeared from his apartment shortly before the search warrant was executed. Analysis of his computer activity showed that he had been monitoring police communications and was aware that he was under investigation. His medical training and detailed knowledge of the city made him a dangerous fugitive who could potentially continue his killing spree while evading capture. Harrison's escape was facilitated by his medical knowledge and access to healthcare facilities throughout the city. He could treat injuries, acquire supplies, and potentially find temporary shelter in hospitals or clinics where his credentials might allow him to blend in with legitimate medical staff. The manhunt required coordination with every healthcare facility in the metropolitan area. Chen coordinated the manhunt from the Task Force Command Center, working with officers from multiple precincts to check Harrison's known associates, favorite locations, and potential hiding places. The search was complicated by Harrison's medical training, which gave him knowledge of how to treat injuries and avoid detection, and his familiarity with hospital facilities that could provide temporary shelter and supplies. The breakthrough came when one of Harrison's potential victims, a mail carrier named David Thompson, reported that he had noticed unusual activity around his apartment building. Thompson had been warned about Harrison and was participating in the protective custody program, but had returned to his apartment to collect personal belongings when he observed someone watching the building from a parked car across the street. Thompson's description of the watcher matched Harrison's physical characteristics, and the surveillance behavior was consistent with Harrison's documented methods of studying his victims before attacking. Chen and Rodriguez responded to Thompson's call and identified the vehicle as a stolen car that Harrison had taken from a hospital parking garage earlier that day. They established surveillance on the vehicle and waited for Harrison to return, knowing that his obsession with his victims would eventually draw him back to continue his surveillance activities. The wait lasted 6 hours, during which time additional units were positioned around the building to prevent Harrison's escape if he detected the police presence. Harrison appeared at 2:30 a.m., approaching Thompson's building with the confidence of someone who believed he was unobserved and in complete control of the situation. He was carrying a medical bag and wearing scrubs, apparently planning to enter the building and murder Thompson in his apartment using the same methods he had employed with his previous victims. Chen and Rodriguez arrested him without incident as he picked the lock on the building's entrance, catching him in the act of attempting to commit another murder. The arrest was anticlimactic after months of investigation. Harrison offered no resistance and seemed almost relieved that his killing spree had finally ended. During his interrogation, Harrison showed no remorse for his crimes and continued to describe them as scientific research that would advance understanding of human psychology in terminal situations. He maintained that his victims had benefited from experiencing authentic death without the medical interventions and social supports that he believed diminished the spiritual and psychological significance of dying. Most people die surrounded by lies and medical intervention, Harrison told investigators during one of several recorded interviews. Doctors telling them everything will be fine, family members pretending they're not dying, medications that cloud their consciousness and prevent them from experiencing the full reality of their mortality. I gave my subjects the truth, clear awareness of their impending death without false hope or medical interference. They died as humans are meant to die, conscious and alone with their thoughts. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed that Harrison viewed death as a transcendent experience that was corrupted by modern medical practice and social customs. His murders weren't motivated by hatred, sexual gratification, or traditional criminal motives, but by a delusional belief that he was providing a service to both his victims and society by studying pure death experiences uncontaminated by medical intervention or social support. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the forensic psychologist who evaluated Harrison, found him to be highly intelligent but completely lacking in empathy for other human beings. He viewed people as research subjects rather than individuals deserving of respect and protection. His medical training had provided him with the technical knowledge to commit sophisticated murders, while his psychological disorders allowed him to rationalize killing as scientific research. Harrison represents a particularly dangerous type of criminal, Dr. Martinez explained in her report. He combines high intelligence with complete lack of empathy, medical knowledge with delusional thinking, and careful planning with obsessive behavior. His belief that he was conducting legitimate research allowed him to commit multiple murders while maintaining a self-image as a scientist rather than a killer. Harrison's trial became a media sensation as prosecutors presented evidence of his elaborate surveillance operation and the calculating nature of his crimes. The testimony of potential victims who had been saved by the investigation provided powerful evidence of the terror Harrison had inflicted on innocent people who had the misfortune to fit his victim profile and live the kind of isolated lives that made them attractive targets. The trial lasted 3 months and included testimony from dozens of witnesses, including surveillance victims, medical experts, and law enforcement officers who had participated in the investigation. Harrison's defense attorneys attempted to argue that his delusions about scientific research constituted evidence of mental illness that should mitigate his culpability, but the prosecution successfully demonstrated that his elaborate planning and sophisticated methods proved he understood the criminal nature of his actions. For Officer Chen, who had initiated the investigation by recognizing the suspicious nature of the Williams crime scene, the case fundamentally changed her understanding of police work, and the types of evil that could hide in plain sight within urban communities. Her coordination of the manhunt and victim protection efforts earned her a promotion to detective, but the psychological impact of confronting Harrison's systematic approach to murder would influence her career for years to come. Harrison taught me that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence or chaos, Chen explained during a training session for new officers several months after the trial concluded. Sometimes it comes disguised as scientific curiosity or professional competence. He used his medical training and his understanding of human nature to identify and exploit the most vulnerable people in our community. That's a reminder that we can't make assumptions about people based on their education or profession. The case prompted a comprehensive review of controlled substance security at area hospitals and medical facilities, leading to enhanced tracking systems, more frequent inventory audits, and stricter protocols for accessing dangerous drugs. Medical licensing boards also implemented more thorough background checks and better communication between institutions when problematic employees moved between facilities. Harrison was ultimately convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder and multiple charges related to stalking and surveillance of his intended victims. His sentence of life without parole ensured that he would never again have the opportunity to practice his twisted form of medical research on unwitting subjects or threaten the safety of vulnerable community members. The surveillance equipment found in Harrison's apartment was used to identify and warn dozens of potential victims who had been unknowingly monitored, many of whom chose to relocate or significantly change their routines to avoid becoming targets for copycat killers who might be inspired by Harrison's methods and sophisticated surveillance techniques. For the Detroit Police Department, the graveyard shift killer case became a training example of how routine calls could mask sophisticated criminal operations, and how patrol officers could play crucial roles in identifying patterns that might be missed by investigators focused on individual cases rather than broader connections. Chen's work in connecting the murders demonstrated the importance of information sharing between precincts and the value of treating patrol officers as intelligence gatherers rather than simply responders to emergency calls. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of isolated individuals within urban communities and the need for social services and community programs that could provide support and monitoring for people living alone without family or social connections. Several of Harrison's victims might have survived if they had had regular contact with family, friends, or social services that would have noticed their disappearance more quickly and initiated welfare checks before the killer had time to stage the crime scenes. Years later, when Chen had become a senior detective specializing in serial crime investigations, she would often reflect on the lessons learned from her first major case and how it had shaped her approach to criminal investigation and victim protection. The graveyard shift killer had taught her that the most dangerous predators were often those who understood the systems they exploited and had the patience to plan their crimes over extended periods. Harrison wasn't a spontaneous killer driven by passion or rage, Chen would tell junior officers during training sessions. He was a methodical predator who used his education and professional skills to commit what he believed were perfect murders. The only reason we caught him was because he couldn't resist continuing his surveillance activities even after he knew he was being investigated. His obsession with his victims and his delusional belief in the importance of his research ultimately led to his downfall. The apartment building where Marcus Williams had lived was eventually renovated and converted to condominiums as part of Detroit's ongoing urban renewal efforts, but longtime residents of the neighborhood still remembered it as the place where the graveyard shift killer's first victim had been discovered. The building's association with the case served as a reminder of how violence could erupt in the most ordinary places, and how the people we least suspect might harbor the darkest intentions and most sophisticated criminal capabilities. The medical community struggled to understand how someone with Harrison's training and apparent dedication to healing could pervert his knowledge into methods of murder and rationalize killing as scientific research. His case became a standard study in medical schools and psychology programs, used to teach students about the potential for professional knowledge to be misused and the importance of ethical standards and psychological screening in healthcare practice. Detective Chen continued to work night shifts throughout her career, finding that the darkness and quiet of the graveyard shift provided the focus she needed for complex investigations and the time to analyze patterns that might be missed during the chaos of the day shift operations. But she never forgot the lesson of her first major case: that evil could wear a white coat and speak with the authority of medical training, and that the most vulnerable members of society deserved protection from those who would exploit their isolation and trust for criminal purposes. The graveyard shift killer had been stopped, but his legacy lived on in the enhanced security measures, improved training protocols, and heightened awareness that his crimes had necessitated. For the officers who worked Detroit's night shifts, Harrison's case served as a permanent reminder that routine calls could mask extraordinary evil, and that vigilance and attention to detail were the primary weapons in the fight against those who preyed on society's most vulnerable members. In the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the city's honest citizens slept safely in their homes, protected by locks and alarm systems, Chen and her colleagues maintained their watch against the darkness that could take human form and wear a professional mask. The graveyard shift would always attract those who sought to exploit the cover of darkness for criminal purposes. But it would also be defended by officers who understood that the night belonged not to the predators, but to those sworn to protect the innocent from the evil that thrived in shadows and silence. The case files on Dr. Michael Harrison filled 3 cabinets in the Detroit Police Department's archives, serving as both a record of his crimes and a resource for future investigations involving medical professionals who might abuse their training and access for criminal purposes. His surveillance photographs and detailed victim profiles remained classified, but his methods continued to influence law enforcement training and psychiatric research into the criminal misuse of professional knowledge and credentials. For the families of Harrison's victims, the knowledge that their loved ones had been selected for murder based on their isolation and vulnerability added an extra dimension of tragedy to their grief and loss. The victims had died not because of anything they had done wrong, but because they fit a profile that made them attractive targets for someone who viewed human life as raw material for psychological experimentation, and believed that murder could be justified as scientific research. The memorial service held for Harrison's victims drew hundreds of attendees from throughout the Detroit metropolitan area, serving as both a tribute to the dead and a reminder of the need for community connections that could protect isolated individuals from predators who sought to exploit their loneliness and vulnerability for criminal purposes. The service was held at the Cathedral of the Most Blessed Sacrament in downtown Detroit, its Gothic architecture providing a solemn backdrop for a ceremony that brought together family members who had traveled from across the country, co-workers who remembered the victims' quiet reliability, and community members who had been shaken by the revelation that such calculated evil had been operating in their neighborhoods. Detective Chen attended in her dress uniform, representing not just the police department, but the broader law enforcement community that had been challenged by Harrison's sophisticated criminal methods. Father Michael O'Brien, who had served the cathedral for over 30 years and had presided over countless funerals for victims of Detroit's urban violence, struggled to find words that could make sense of Harrison's crimes. "We gather today not just to mourn the loss of 4 good people," he said during his homily, but to confront the reality that evil can disguise itself as healing, that those entrusted with preserving life can pervert their knowledge to destroy it. Marcus Williams, Patricia Thompson, David Chen, and Maria Rodriguez were taken from us not by random violence or criminal passion, but by someone who had convinced himself that murder was research and that death was a gift he was qualified to bestow. the victims' families spoke during the service, their words providing glimpses into the lives that Harrison had studied so carefully before ending them. Marcus Williams' sister, who had traveled from California, described her brother's simple pleasures: his love of classic movies, his weekend fishing trips to Lake Huron, his dream of saving enough money to buy a small house with a garden where he could grow vegetables. These human details stood in stark contrast to Harrison's clinical observations and served as a reminder that his victims had been people with hopes and dreams, rather than research subjects in a delusional experiment. Patricia Thompson's adult daughter read from letters her mother had written, describing her satisfaction with her job at the main library branch, where she had worked for 15 years helping visitors find information and assisting children with homework. David Chen's nephew spoke about his uncle's pride in his work as a postal carrier, how he knew every resident on his route by name, and worried about elderly customers who depended on him for daily human contact. Maria Rodriguez's sister described her dedication to her job with the city sanitation department and her evening classes at community college, where she was working toward a degree in environmental science. These testimonials revealed the cruel irony of Harrison's victim selection. He had targeted people whose jobs involved serving their community. Individuals who spent their days helping others but returned each night to empty apartments where their isolation made them vulnerable to a predator, who viewed their loneliness as an opportunity for exploitation. The psychological impact of the case extended far beyond the immediate investigation and trial. Mental health professionals throughout the Detroit area reported increased anxiety among their patients, particularly those who lived alone and worked in public service positions that matched Harrison's victim profile. The knowledge that someone with medical training had used professional skills to commit murder challenged fundamental assumptions about the trustworthiness of healthcare providers and the safety of routine medical interactions. Dr. Sandra Williams, a psychiatrist who treated several of Harrison's surviving surveillance victims, noted that the psychological trauma extended beyond the fear of death to include a profound sense of violation and loss of privacy. These individuals discovered that their most intimate moments, eating breakfast, reading in bed, watching television, had been observed and recorded by someone who was planning to kill them, Dr. Williams explained. The violation of privacy is almost as traumatic as the threat to their lives. They feel like they can never be truly alone or safe again, because Harrison taught them that privacy is an illusion, and that predators can find ways to watch and study them without their knowledge. The case also had broader implications for urban social policy and community planning. Harrison's success in identifying and targeting isolated individuals highlighted the dangers of social fragmentation in large cities, where people could live anonymously without meaningful connections to neighbors, co-workers, or community institutions. Urban planners and social service agencies began developing programs designed to create stronger community connections and support networks for residents who might otherwise remain isolated and vulnerable. The Detroit Police Department implemented new protocols for welfare checks and death investigations, requiring officers to look more carefully for signs of staging or pre-mortem surveillance. Training programs were developed to help officers recognize evidence of prolonged observation and to understand the psychological profiles of predators who might target isolated individuals for elaborate crimes. Chen's role in the investigation earned her recognition throughout the law enforcement community, and offers for positions with federal agencies and major metropolitan police departments. However, she chose to remain with the Detroit Police Department, accepting a promotion to the Detective Bureau and specializing in cases involving serial crimes and predatory behavior. "Detroit is my home," Chen explained when asked why she turned down lucrative offers from other agencies. "The problems we face here, urban decay, social isolation, the breakdown of community connections. These are the same problems that allowed Harrison to operate undetected for so long. I want to be part of the solution. helping to build the kind of community where predators like Harrison can't find easy victims because everyone is connected to someone who would notice if they disappeared. Chen's new position involved working with community organizations, social service agencies, and neighborhood groups to develop early warning systems for identifying individuals who might be at risk of victimization due to their isolation or vulnerability. The programs focused on creating regular contact points through libraries, community centers, religious organizations, and volunteer programs that could provide both social connection and safety monitoring for residents who might otherwise remain unnoticed by their communities. The success of these programs was measured not just in crime prevention statistics, but in the broader sense of community engagement and mutual responsibility they fostered. Neighborhoods that had been characterized by anonymity and indifference began developing stronger social networks and more effective informal surveillance systems that could identify both potential victims and potential predators before crimes occurred. Harrison's surveillance methods were studied by federal law enforcement agencies and incorporated into training programs for investigating stalking and predatory behavior. The sophisticated nature of his equipment and techniques served as a warning about the capabilities available to modern criminals and the need for law enforcement to keep pace with technological developments that could be used for criminal purposes. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit added Harrison's case to their database of serial killer profiles, noting the unusual combination of medical knowledge, sophisticated surveillance techniques, and delusional rationalization that characterized his crimes. The profile was distributed to law enforcement agencies nationwide as part of training programs designed to help investigators recognize similar patterns of behavior before they escalated to murder. International law enforcement agencies also studied Harrison's methods, particularly his use of medical knowledge and pharmaceutical access to commit murders designed to appear natural. The case contributed to enhanced security protocols for controlled substances and improved communication between medical licensing boards and law enforcement agencies when healthcare professionals exhibited concerning behavior. The apartment building where Harrison had lived was eventually converted to low-income housing as part of Detroit's urban renewal efforts, but not before extensive security upgrades were installed to prevent future surveillance activities. The building's new owners implemented enhanced background checks for tenants and installed comprehensive security systems that would make it difficult for residents to conduct the kind of extended surveillance operations that Harrison had managed from his previous location. The Detroit General Hospital, where Harrison had worked and stolen the paralytic drugs used in his crimes, implemented new security protocols for controlled substances and enhanced monitoring of staff access to dangerous medications. The hospital also established a peer reporting system that encouraged healthcare workers to report colleagues who exhibited unusual interest in death, displayed inappropriate behavior toward patients, or seemed to be studying dying processes with unnecessary intensity. Medical schools throughout the country added Harrison's case to their ethics curricula, using his crimes as an example of how medical knowledge could be perverted for criminal purposes and the importance of psychological screening for students entering healthcare professions. The case served as a stark reminder that technical knowledge without ethical grounding could be extremely dangerous in the wrong hands. 5 years after Harrison's conviction, Detective Chen was promoted to sergeant and assigned to lead a specialized unit focused on investigating crimes against vulnerable populations. The unit worked closely with social service agencies, healthcare providers, and community organizations to identify individuals who might be at risk of victimization and to investigate crimes that specifically targeted people because of their isolation, age, or other vulnerabilities. Chen's unit developed innovative investigative techniques that combined traditional police work with social network analysis and community engagement strategies. They worked to identify not just individual criminals, but the social conditions and systemic failures that allowed predators to find and exploit vulnerable victims. Their approach emphasized prevention as much as prosecution, focusing on strengthening community connections and support systems that could protect potential victims before crimes occurred. The unit's success was measured not just in arrests and convictions, but in the reduction of victimization rates among vulnerable populations, and the increased community awareness of predatory behavior patterns. Chen's team worked with neighborhood associations, senior centers, libraries, and other community institutions to create informal networks that could identify both potential victims and potential predators while fostering the kind of social connections that made communities safer for everyone. Harrison remained incarcerated at the Michigan Reformatory in Ionia, where he continued to maintain that his crimes were justified as scientific research. Prison psychologists who evaluated him found no evidence of remorse or recognition that his actions had caused harm to innocent people. He spent his time writing detailed analyses of his crimes and developing theoretical frameworks for what he continued to describe as thanatological research. Prison officials allowed Harrison to correspond with legitimate academic researchers studying criminal psychology, but his letters were carefully monitored to prevent him from inspiring copycat crimes or sharing detailed information about his surveillance and murder techniques. Several researchers who studied his case noted that his complete lack of empathy and his continued belief in the validity of his research made him an unusually dangerous type of criminal who would likely attempt to resume his activities if ever released. The case files on Harrison's crimes continued to grow as investigators identified additional potential victims and studied his methods for insights that could prevent similar crimes. Cold case detectives in cities where Harrison had previously lived or worked examined unsolved deaths to determine whether he might have been responsible for murders that had gone undetected during his medical training and early career. These investigations revealed several suspicious deaths at hospitals where Harrison had worked as a student or resident, including patients who had died unexpectedly from complications that seemed inconsistent with their medical conditions. While definitive evidence linking Harrison to these deaths was lacking, the pattern of unexplained fatalities that occurred during his tenure at various medical facilities suggested that his killing spree might have begun much earlier than originally believed. Dr. Robert Martinez, a forensic psychiatrist who studied Harrison's case extensively, published a comprehensive analysis of his crimes that became a standard reference for law enforcement and mental health professionals. Dr. Martinez's research identified several warning signs that might have predicted Harrison's criminal behavior, including his excessive interest in death and dying during medical school, complaints about boundary violations with patients and colleagues, and his pattern of moving between institutions after interpersonal conflicts. Harrison represents a perfect storm of factors that created an extremely dangerous individual, Dr. Martinez wrote in his analysis. His medical knowledge provided the technical skills needed to commit to sophisticated murders. His psychological disorders eliminated normal empathy and moral constraints, and his delusional belief system allowed him to rationalize murder as research. The combination of these factors, along with his access to vulnerable victims through his surveillance activities, created a predator whose crimes were both highly sophisticated and extremely difficult to detect. The research also identified systemic failures in medical education and healthcare employment that had allowed Harrison to continue his career, despite warning signs that should have triggered intervention. Recommendations from the study led to enhanced psychological screening for medical students, improved communication between healthcare institutions about problematic employees, and better protocols for reporting and investigating concerning behavior by healthcare professionals. 10 years after the original investigation, Detroit's Corktown neighborhood had been largely transformed by urban renewal efforts, with many of the abandoned buildings replaced by new housing and commercial developments. The building where Marcus Williams had lived was now part of a thriving residential complex, but longtime residents still remembered the fear that had gripped the community when Harrison's crimes were revealed. Community organizations that had been formed in response to the case continued to operate, providing social services and community connections for residents who might otherwise remain isolated. These programs had become models for other cities dealing with similar challenges of urban anonymity and social fragmentation. Chen, now a lieutenant with over 15 years of experience investigating crimes against vulnerable populations, continued to speak at conferences and training sessions about the lessons learned from the graveyard shift killer case. Her presentations emphasized the importance of community, engagement in crime prevention, and the need for law enforcement to understand the social conditions that created vulnerability to predatory behavior. Harrison succeeded because he understood how to exploit social isolation and institutional gaps that allowed vulnerable people to remain invisible to their communities, Chen explained during a presentation to the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Our response has to address not just individual criminals, but the social conditions that create opportunities for predatory behavior. We need to build communities where everyone is connected to someone who would notice if they disappeared, and where unusual behavior gets reported before it escalates to violence. The case also influenced Chen's approach to training new officers, emphasizing the importance of seeing patrol work as intelligence gathering and community engagement rather than simply responding to emergency calls. She taught officers to pay attention to social dynamics and community conditions that might indicate vulnerability to criminal exploitation, and to understand their role in building the community connections that served as the first line of defense against predatory behavior. Harrison's crimes had revealed the dark side of urban anonymity and professional respectability, but the response to his case had demonstrated the power of community engagement and coordinated law enforcement efforts to protect vulnerable populations. The investigation had required unprecedented cooperation between multiple agencies and community organizations, creating new models for addressing complex criminal behavior that crossed traditional jurisdictional and professional boundaries. The memorial garden created in honor of Harrison's victims was located in Hart Plaza, overlooking the Detroit River, and serving as a reminder of both the lives lost and the community strength that had emerged in response to the tragedy. The garden included plaques with the victims' names and quotes emphasizing the importance of community connection and mutual responsibility for protecting vulnerable neighbors. Visitors to the memorial often left flowers or personal notes, and the site became a gathering place for community events focused on crime prevention and social support. The garden served as a symbol of Detroit's resilience and its commitment to creating the kind of community connections that could prevent future tragedies like Harrison's killing spree. The graveyard shift killer case had ended with justice for the victims and enhanced protection for vulnerable community members, but its legacy continued to influence law enforcement practice, community development, and social policy throughout the Detroit metropolitan area and beyond. The case served as a powerful reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who combine sophisticated knowledge with the ability to exploit social weaknesses, and that effective crime prevention requires community engagement as much as law enforcement expertise. For the officers who worked Detroit's night shifts, Harrison's case remained a constant reminder of the complex challenges they faced in protecting a diverse urban community from predators who understood how to exploit isolation, vulnerability, and institutional gaps for criminal purposes. The graveyard shift would always be a time when honest citizens were most vulnerable and predators most active, but it would also be defended by officers who understood that their work involved building community connections as much as enforcing laws and investigating crimes. The darkness that had concealed Harrison's surveillance and murder activities also sheltered the guardians who worked tirelessly to ensure that the night belonged not to those who would do harm, but to those committed to protecting the innocent and building the kind of community where everyone was valued, noticed, and protected from those who would exploit their vulnerabilities for criminal purposes. The 911 call came through dispatch at 1:23 a.m. on a sweltering September night in 2024. Cutting through the radio chatter that filled Phoenix Police Department's Central City Precinct like the desperate whisper of someone who had finally found the courage to speak about horrors they could no longer bear in silence. Detective Luis Ramirez had been nursing his fourth cup of coffee of the shift, studying case files spread across his desk in the squad room that never seemed to cool down, despite the industrial air conditioning units that ran constantly but futilely against the desert heat that seeped through every crack and crevice of the aging building. All units. We have a domestic disturbance call at 2847 East Van Buren Street, apartment 12. Caller reports screaming from neighboring unit, sounds of violence, requesting immediate response. Caller wishes to remain anonymous. Ramirez grabbed his keys and badge, grateful for something that might break the mind-numbing routine of another slow Tuesday night in one of Phoenix's most troubled neighborhoods. The graveyard shift in Central City Precinct typically brought a predictable parade of domestic violence calls, drug-related incidents, and the occasional armed robbery at one of the 24-hour convenience stores that served as beacons of fluorescent light in areas where most legitimate businesses had long since fled or been driven out by crime and urban decay. Van Buren Street had once been part of Phoenix's historic downtown corridor, but decades of urban neglect had transformed it into a strip of rundown apartment complexes, cheap motels, and businesses that operated on the margins of legality. The area attracted transients, addicts, prostitutes, and others who needed to remain invisible to mainstream society, creating a perfect environment for predators who understood how to exploit the anonymity and social disconnection that characterized life on the streets. But as Ramirez drove through the empty streets toward the address, something felt different about this call. The dispatcher's voice had carried an undertone of urgency that suggested the caller had reported something more disturbing than the typical domestic dispute. In his 8 years working night shifts in Central City, Ramirez had developed an instinct for distinguishing between routine calls and situations that might involve serious violence or immediate danger to victims who couldn't protect themselves. 2847 East Van Buren Street was a 3-story stucco building that had been painted institutional green sometime in the 1980s, but now showed the effects of decades of Arizona sun, desert wind, and minimal maintenance. The paint was peeling in long strips that revealed patches of concrete underneath, giving the building the appearance of a diseased animal shedding its skin. Security bars covered all ground floor windows, and the parking lot was illuminated by a single streetlight that flickered intermittently, creating pools of harsh light surrounded by deep shadows. Ramirez met Officer Jennifer Martinez in the parking lot. Martinez was a 5-year veteran of the Phoenix PD who had requested assignment to night shift patrol because she preferred the honesty of darkness to the political complexities of day shift operations. She was known throughout the precinct as thorough, professional, and unflappable in situations that would rattle less experienced officers. "What do we know about the call?" Ramirez asked as they approached the building's entrance, both officers automatically checking their surroundings for potential threats or escape routes. Anonymous caller reported hearing screaming from apartment 12, sounds of someone being hurt, Martinez replied, consulting her notes. Caller said it's been going on for about 20 minutes, getting louder and more violent. Building manager isn't available, but we can access the common areas and check for signs of disturbance. The building's lobby was dimly lit and smelled of industrial disinfectant, mixed with cigarette smoke and human desperation. A directory near the mailboxes showed apartment 12 as belonging to Maria Santos, a name that appeared on several incident reports Ramirez had filed over the past year for minor disturbances and welfare checks. Santos was known to local police as a quiet woman in her 30s who kept to herself and seemed to have few visitors or social connections. As they climbed the stairs to the second floor, both officers became aware of an unusual sound coming from the direction of apartment 12. It wasn't the typical noise of a domestic dispute, shouting, breaking objects, or the sounds of physical struggle. Instead, they heard what sounded like someone speaking in a low, rhythmic cadence, almost like chanting or prayer, punctuated by softer sounds that might have been whimpering or crying. Ramirez and Martinez exchanged glances that communicated their shared sense that this call was unlike the routine domestic disturbances they handled regularly. The sounds suggested something more complex and potentially more dangerous than a simple argument between intimate partners. They approached apartment 12 with weapons drawn but not raised, following department protocol for domestic calls where the nature of the threat remained unclear. Ramirez positioned himself beside the door, while Martinez took a covering position that would allow her to respond to threats from either the apartment or the hallway. The sounds from inside the apartment were clearer now, a male voice speaking in Spanish in what sounded like a religious or ritualistic manner, mixed with female voices that seemed to be responding or pleading. Ramirez, who was fluent in Spanish due to his childhood in a bilingual household, could make out fragments of what sounded like prayers or incantations mixed with threats and demands for compliance. "Phoenix Police Department," Ramirez called out in both English and Spanish, knocking firmly on the apartment door. "We received a complaint about disturbance. We need to speak with the residents." The sounds from inside the apartment stopped immediately, replaced by a silence that seemed more ominous than the disturbing noises they had been investigating. After several seconds, they heard movement inside the apartment. Footsteps, whispered conversations, and what sounded like furniture being moved or rearranged. "Police Department," Martinez called out, her voice carrying the authority developed through years of dealing with situations where compliance could mean the difference between peaceful resolution and violence. "Open the door, please. We need to verify that everyone is safe." A male voice responded from inside the apartment, speaking accented English with the careful pronunciation of someone for whom the language was not native. "Officers, there is no problem here. We are conducting religious ceremony. No one is hurt. Please go away." The response raised immediate red flags for both officers. Legitimate religious ceremonies didn't typically generate complaints about screaming and violence, and the speaker's insistence that police leave without verification suggested he had something to hide. Department protocol required welfare checks on all individuals present during domestic calls, particularly when anonymous reports suggested someone might be in danger. "Sir, we need to see everyone who is in the apartment to verify their safety," Ramirez explained through the door. "This is standard procedure for all domestic calls. Please open the door and step outside so we can talk." The response was several minutes of silence, followed by more movement and whispered conversations in Spanish that Ramirez could only partially understand. He caught fragments about police, trouble, and what sounded like instructions about hiding something or someone. The delay in apparent coordination suggested multiple people were inside the apartment, contradicting the caller's claim that only religious ceremony was taking place. "We were going to count to 10, then we need the door opened," Martinez announced, her hand moving to her radio to call for backup if the situation escalated. 1, 2, 3. The door opened on the count of 7, revealing a middle-aged Hispanic man wearing dark clothing and an expression of forced calm that didn't match the nervousness visible in his body language. Behind him, the apartment was dimly lit by candles, and Ramirez could see several other figures in the background, mostly women who seemed to be trying to remain out of sight. "I am Pastor Miguel Herrera," the man said, extending his hands to show he wasn't armed. We are conducting prayer service for spiritual healing. No laws are broken, no one is hurt. But even as Herrera spoke, Ramirez could see evidence that contradicted his explanation. The apartment had been hastily rearranged, with furniture pushed against walls and what appeared to be restraints or ropes partially hidden under blankets. More disturbing were the women visible in the background, who seemed to be in various states of distress and showed signs of physical restraint or abuse. "Pastor Herrera, we need to come inside and speak with everyone present," Ramirez said, stepping forward in a way that made clear the request was actually a demand. "We have reports of disturbance and potential violence. Everyone needs to be interviewed separately to ensure their safety." The situation deteriorated rapidly when Martinez noticed one of the women in the background mouthing the word "help" while pointing toward a back room of the apartment. At the same time, Ramirez observed what appeared to be restraint marks on the wrists of another woman, and noticed that several of the alleged congregation members seemed to be positioned to block access to other parts of the apartment. "Step aside, Pastor Herrera," Martinez ordered, her weapon now drawn and pointed at the ground in ready position. "Everyone in the apartment needs to move to the living room area where we can see them. Now." What they discovered inside the apartment would transform a routine domestic call into one of the most complex criminal investigations in Phoenix Police Department history. The apartment had been converted into what could only be described as a torture chamber disguised as a religious facility. The back rooms contained restraint devices, medical equipment, and evidence of systematic abuse that had been inflicted on multiple victims over an extended period. Most disturbing was evidence that the abuse had been documented through photographs and videos, suggesting a sophisticated criminal operation rather than spontaneous violence. The congregation consisted of 8 women, ranging in age from late teens to early 40s, all showing signs of physical and psychological abuse. They had been told they were participating in religious purification rituals that would cleanse them of sins and prepare them for salvation, but were actually victims of a human trafficking operation that combined religious manipulation with systematic exploitation. Pastor Miguel Herrera was not a legitimate religious leader, but a former psychiatric nurse who had been dismissed from several healthcare facilities for inappropriate behavior toward female patients. He had used his medical knowledge and understanding of psychological manipulation to create a cult-like organization that preyed on vulnerable women, particularly undocumented immigrants who feared contact with law enforcement. The investigation that followed would reveal a network of similar operations throughout the Southwest, all connected through online communications and shared resources for trafficking victims between cities and states. Herrera's Phoenix operation was part of a larger criminal enterprise that used religious rhetoric and psychological manipulation to control victims while generating profits through forced labor, prostitution, and the production of exploitation videos. Detective Ramirez coordinated the initial response, calling for additional units, medical personnel, and specialists from the department's human trafficking unit. The scene required careful processing to preserve evidence, while ensuring the immediate safety and medical care of victims who had been systematically abused and manipulated over periods ranging from weeks to several years. Officer Martinez took responsibility for securing the scene and coordinating with patrol units that established a perimeter around the building to prevent escape of additional suspects who might be operating in the area. The investigation would eventually reveal that Herrera's operation involved multiple apartments in the building and coordination with similar groups throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area. The victims required extensive medical evaluation and psychological support to address both their physical injuries and the complex trauma resulting from prolonged manipulation and abuse. Many had been convinced that they deserved punishment for supposed sins and that cooperation with their abusers was necessary for spiritual salvation, making it difficult for them to understand that they were victims of crimes rather than participants in religious practices. Dr. Angela Rodriguez, a forensic psychologist who specialized in cult deprogramming and trafficking victim recovery, was brought in to assist with victim interviews and provide expert analysis of the psychological techniques Herrera had used to maintain control over his victims. Her evaluation revealed sophisticated methods that combined religious manipulation with medical knowledge to create total psychological dependence. Herrera used religious authority and medical credentials to create a perfect system of control, Dr. Rodriguez explained to the investigation team. His victims believed they were receiving spiritual healing and medical treatment when they were actually being systematically abused and exploited. The combination of religious guilt, medical authority, and social isolation made it nearly impossible for them to recognize their situation as criminal abuse. The investigation revealed that Herrera had been operating his trafficking network for over 3 years, moving victims between locations throughout Arizona, New Mexico, and California. His operation generated income through multiple means: forced labor in legitimate businesses that were either complicit or unaware of the coercion involved, prostitution services marketed through online platforms, and the production of exploitation videos sold to international customers. The religious facade had been carefully constructed to provide cover for the operation, while serving as a powerful psychological tool for controlling victims. Herrera had studied cult psychology and religious manipulation techniques, combining them with his medical background to create methods of control that were both sophisticated and extremely difficult for victims to resist or escape. Detective Ramirez's investigation required coordination with federal agencies, international law enforcement, and specialists in religious crimes to understand the full scope of Herrera's network and identify all victims and co-conspirators. The case involved multiple jurisdictions and required expertise in areas ranging from immigration law to cult psychology to international trafficking networks. The Phoenix Police Department's Human Trafficking Unit, led by Detective Captain Sarah Kim, took over primary responsibility for the investigation once the scope of the criminal operation became clear. Captain Kim had 15 years of experience investigating complex trafficking cases and understood the challenges involved in prosecuting crimes that combined religious manipulation with international criminal networks. Cases like Herrera's represent the evolution of human trafficking into more sophisticated forms that are harder to detect and prosecute, Captain Kim explained to the task force assembled to investigate the network. Traditional trafficking relies on force and physical coercion, but these operations use psychological manipulation and perceived authority to achieve the same results while making it harder for victims to recognize their situation or seek help. The investigation required extensive cooperation with immigrant advocacy groups and religious organizations to reach potential victims who might be reluctant to contact law enforcement due to immigration status concerns or religious beliefs that had been manipulated to discourage cooperation with authorities. Community outreach efforts were conducted in multiple languages and through trusted intermediaries who could help victims understand their rights and the resources available to assist their recovery. The evidence collected from Herrera's apartment revealed connections to similar operations in Los Angeles, Albuquerque, Denver, and Houston, leading to coordinated raids that ultimately dismantled a network involving dozens of perpetrators and hundreds of victims. The Phoenix case served as the foundation for a federal prosecution that would take years to complete and result in sentences ranging from 15 years to life imprisonment for various participants. For Detective Ramirez, the case fundamentally changed his understanding of criminal investigation and the complexity of modern trafficking operations. His initial response to what appeared to be a domestic disturbance call had uncovered a sophisticated criminal network that challenged traditional assumptions about how trafficking operations functioned and how they could be detected and prosecuted. The Herrera case taught me that we can't make assumptions about what we're dealing with based on initial appearances, Ramirez later explained to training classes for new detectives. What looked like a domestic disturbance or religious gathering was actually a complex criminal operation that had been carefully designed to avoid detection while systematically exploiting vulnerable women. We have to be prepared to look beyond the obvious and investigate deeper when something doesn't feel right. The case also highlighted the importance of community partnerships in detecting and responding to trafficking operations that relied on isolation and fear to maintain control over victims. The anonymous caller who had reported the disturbance had provided the crucial tip that led to the discovery of Herrera's operation, demonstrating the vital role that community awareness and reporting played in combating sophisticated criminal networks. Phoenix Police Department implemented new training programs for patrol officers focusing on recognizing signs of trafficking and cult-like manipulation that might not be immediately obvious during routine calls. Officers were taught to look for psychological indicators of coercive control, signs of systematic abuse that extended beyond individual incidents, and evidence of organizational structures that suggested ongoing criminal enterprises rather than isolated crimes. The department also established stronger partnerships with immigrant advocacy groups, religious organizations, and social service agencies to create networks that could identify potential victims and provide appropriate resources for recovery and protection. These partnerships were essential for reaching populations that might be reluctant to contact law enforcement directly due to legal status concerns or cultural barriers. Officer Martinez, who had been instrumental in recognizing the signs of distress among Herrera's victims, was promoted to detective and assigned to the Human Trafficking Unit, where her observational skills and community connections made her particularly effective at identifying operations that used psychological manipulation and religious authority to control victims. The Martinez promotion recognized not just her individual contribution to this case, but the importance of having officers who understand the psychological aspects of modern trafficking operations, Captain Kim explained. These crimes are becoming more sophisticated and harder to detect, requiring investigators who can recognize subtle signs of coercion and manipulation that might not be immediately obvious. The trial of Pastor Miguel Herrera and his co-conspirators became a landmark case in trafficking prosecution, establishing important precedents for how religious manipulation and psychological coercion could be prosecuted under federal trafficking laws. The case required extensive expert testimony about cult psychology, religious manipulation techniques, and the medical knowledge that had been used to facilitate systematic abuse. Herrera was ultimately convicted on multiple counts of human trafficking, forced labor, sexual exploitation, and conspiracy charges that carried a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His conviction sent a clear message to other trafficking operations that used religious or medical authority to exploit victims, while providing some measure of justice for the women who had suffered under his control. The victims of Herrera's operation required years of recovery support, including medical treatment, psychological counseling, legal assistance with immigration status, and job training to help them rebuild their lives after years of exploitation and manipulation. The Phoenix Police Department worked with federal agencies and non-profit organizations to ensure that comprehensive services were available and that victims received the long-term support needed for successful recovery. Several of Herrera's victims eventually became advocates for other trafficking survivors, using their experiences to help law enforcement and service providers better understand the psychological impact of trafficking and the challenges involved in recovery from systematic manipulation and abuse. Their advocacy work helped improve services for future victims and contributed to better training programs for law enforcement officers. Dr. Rodriguez's analysis of Herrera's psychological techniques became a standard reference for understanding how trafficking operations used religious and medical authority to control victims. Her research contributed to enhanced training programs for law enforcement, social service providers, and healthcare workers who might encounter trafficking victims in their professional roles. Herrera's case demonstrates how traffickers are evolving their methods to exploit not just physical vulnerability, but psychological and spiritual needs, Dr. Rodriguez wrote in her comprehensive analysis. Understanding these techniques is essential for law enforcement and service providers who want to effectively identify and assist victims of these sophisticated criminal operations. For the officers who worked Phoenix's night shifts, the Herrera case remained a defining example of how routine calls could reveal complex criminal operations, and how careful investigation and community partnership could dismantle networks that preyed on society's most vulnerable members. The case had transformed not just investigative procedures, but the broader understanding of how modern trafficking operations functioned, and how law enforcement could effectively respond to crimes that combined psychological manipulation with systematic exploitation. The evening briefings that preceded each night shift now included specific training modules developed from the Herrera case, teaching officers to recognize signs of systematic abuse, religious manipulation, and the psychological indicators that distinguished cult-like control from legitimate religious practice. These briefings were conducted by specialists who had worked on the original investigation, ensuring that institutional knowledge was preserved and transmitted to new officers joining the department. Officer Maria Gonzalez, who had joined the Phoenix PD 2 years after the Herrera case concluded, represented the new generation of officers whose training incorporated lessons learned from the investigation. Her academy classes had included extensive modules on human trafficking, religious manipulation, and the psychological techniques used by sophisticated criminal networks to control victims. The Herrera case changed everything about how we approach domestic disturbance calls, Officer Gonzalez explained during a ride-along with a local news reporter. We don't just look for immediate signs of violence anymore. We're trained to recognize patterns of systematic control, signs of multiple victims, and evidence of organizational structures that suggest ongoing criminal enterprises rather than isolated incidents. The impact of enhanced training became evident in subsequent investigations that identified and dismantled several trafficking operations that might have gone undetected under previous protocols. Officers who had been trained to recognize the subtle signs of systematic abuse were able to identify victims who might otherwise have remained invisible to law enforcement, leading to prosecutions that disrupted criminal networks before they could expand their operations. The Phoenix Police Department's partnership with immigrant advocacy groups had also evolved significantly since the Herrera case, creating trust and communication channels that enabled community members to report suspicious activities without fear of immigration enforcement. These partnerships had been essential for identifying trafficking operations that specifically targeted undocumented immigrants, knowing that their victims' legal status would make them reluctant to seek help from authorities. Detective Carlos Rodriguez, who had joined the Human Trafficking Unit shortly after the Herrera investigation concluded, had spent 5 years building relationships with community organizations throughout Phoenix's diverse neighborhoods. His work focused on creating safe reporting channels and support networks that could identify potential victims while providing resources for recovery and protection. The Herrera case taught us that trafficking operations succeed by isolating victims from potential sources of help, Detective Rodriguez explained during a community meeting at a local immigrant resource center. Our response has to focus on rebuilding those connections and creating multiple pathways for victims to seek assistance, whether through law enforcement, social services, or community organizations. The success of these community partnerships was measured not just in the number of trafficking cases identified and prosecuted, but in the broader sense of safety and trust that it developed between law enforcement and vulnerable populations. Community members who might previously have avoided contact with police were now more likely to report suspicious activities and seek assistance when needed. The federal prosecution of Herrera's trafficking network had taken 3 years to complete, involving testimony from dozens of victims and expert witnesses who explained the psychological techniques used to maintain control over trafficking victims. The complexity of the case had required prosecutors to develop new strategies for presenting evidence about religious manipulation and systematic psychological abuse to juries who might not understand the sophisticated methods used by modern trafficking operations. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, who had led the federal prosecution, noted that the Herrera case had established important legal precedents for how religious manipulation could be prosecuted under trafficking statutes. The case demonstrated that psychological coercion can be just as effective as physical force in maintaining control over victims, Walsh explained. The legal system had to evolve to recognize and prosecute these more sophisticated forms of trafficking. The convictions obtained in the Herrera case had resulted in sentences ranging from 15 years to life imprisonment for various members of the trafficking network. The severity of the sentences reflected both the extent of the crimes and their impact on victims who had suffered years of systematic abuse and exploitation. Several defendants had attempted to appeal their convictions by claiming religious freedom protections, but appellate courts had consistently ruled that legitimate religious practice did not protect criminal exploitation of vulnerable individuals. Herrera himself had been sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, after being convicted on charges that included human trafficking, forced labor, sexual exploitation, and conspiracy. His medical license had been permanently revoked, and his assets had been forfeited to provide restitution for victims and fund expanded trafficking prevention programs. The investigation had also revealed the international scope of modern trafficking networks, leading to cooperation with law enforcement agencies in Mexico, Central America, and Europe to identify and prosecute co-conspirators who had been involved in recruiting and transporting victims. This international cooperation had disrupted trafficking routes and financial networks that extended far beyond the Phoenix operation. Interpol had added the Herrera case to their database of trafficking investigations, using the psychological techniques and organizational methods identified during the investigation to help other countries recognize and respond to similar operations. The case had contributed to enhanced international protocols for investigating trafficking operations that used religious manipulation and medical authority to control victims. The victims of Herrera's trafficking operation had required extensive support services that extended years beyond the initial rescue and investigation. The Phoenix Police Department had worked with federal agencies and nonprofit organizations to ensure that comprehensive services were available, including medical treatment, psychological counseling, legal assistance with immigration status, job training, and long-term housing support. The Herrera case had also influenced the development of specialized housing for trafficking survivors, recognizing that traditional homeless shelters and domestic violence facilities were not equipped to address the complex needs of individuals recovering from systematic psychological manipulation and exploitation. Purpose-built facilities provided the security, specialized services, and long-term support needed for successful recovery. Dr. Elena Martinez, who directed Phoenix's specialized trafficking survivor services, had worked with dozens of Herrera's victims during their recovery process. Her experience had contributed to the development of treatment protocols that addressed the unique psychological impact of religious manipulation and medical abuse combined with trafficking exploitation. Herrera's victims faced challenges that were different from those experienced by survivors of other trafficking operations, Dr. Martinez explained. They had to overcome not just the trauma of exploitation, but the psychological conditioning that had convinced them they deserved punishment and that their suffering was spiritually necessary. Recovery required specialized approaches that addressed both the trauma and the manipulated belief systems. The success of survivor services was measured not just in immediate recovery outcomes, but in long-term indicators of stability and independence. Many of Herrera's victims had successfully completed educational programs, obtained stable employment, and established healthy relationships and social connections. Several had become advocates for other trafficking survivors, using their experiences to help improve services and support systems. The transformation of Herrera's victims from exploited individuals to advocates and community leaders represented one of the most positive outcomes of the investigation. Their willingness to share their experiences had contributed to better understanding of trafficking psychology and more effective recovery programs for future survivors. Ana Rodriguez, who had been one of Herrera's victims for over 2 years before the police intervention, had completed a college degree and become a certified counselor specializing in trauma recovery. Her work with other trafficking survivors provided both practical support and hope that recovery and rebuilding were possible even after years of systematic abuse. The police officers who responded to that call saved my life, but they also gave me the opportunity to help save others, Rodriguez explained during a presentation to law enforcement officials. My experience as a victim taught me things about trafficking that can help officers recognize situations and help survivors in ways that might not be obvious to someone who hasn't experienced this kind of exploitation. The educational and advocacy work performed by survivors had become an integral part of Phoenix's approach to trafficking prevention and response. Their insights had improved training programs for law enforcement, enhanced services for other survivors, and contributed to community awareness campaigns that helped residents recognize and report suspected trafficking activities. The Phoenix Police Department had also established a Survivors Advisory Council that provided input on policies and procedures related to trafficking investigations and victim services. This council ensured that survivor perspectives were incorporated into decision-making processes and that services continued to evolve based on the actual needs and experiences of individuals recovering from trafficking exploitation. The religious community in Phoenix had been profoundly impacted by the Herrera case, leading to enhanced screening procedures for religious leaders and better protocols for identifying and reporting suspected abuse within religious organizations. Established religious institutions had worked with law enforcement to develop guidelines that balanced religious freedom with the need to prevent criminal exploitation of spiritual authority. The Interfaith Alliance of Greater Phoenix had established a task force focused on trafficking prevention and survivor support, bringing together representatives from various religious traditions to address the ways that legitimate faith communities could be manipulated by criminal operations. This task force had developed educational materials and reporting protocols that helped religious organizations protect their members from exploitation while supporting survivors in their recovery process. Father Michael O'Connor, who served on the Interfaith Alliance task force, noted that the Herrera case had forced religious communities to confront the reality that spiritual authority could be perverted for criminal purposes. We had to acknowledge that our respect for religious leadership and our reluctance to question spiritual authority could be exploited by predators, Father O'Connor explained. The case taught us that protecting vulnerable individuals requires active vigilance, not passive trust. The medical community had also implemented enhanced oversight and reporting procedures in response to the Herrera case. Medical licensing boards had strengthened screening procedures for healthcare professionals and improved communication systems for sharing information about practitioners who exhibited concerning behavior toward vulnerable patients or made inappropriate use of medical authority. The Arizona State Board of Medical Examiners had revised its licensing procedures to include more comprehensive background checks and psychological evaluations for applicants with histories of boundary violations or disciplinary actions at previous positions. The board had also implemented mandatory reporting requirements for healthcare facilities that identified practitioners who might be abusing their medical authority or exploiting patient vulnerability. Dr. Sarah Kim, who served on the state medical board, explained that the Herrera case had demonstrated how medical knowledge and authority could be perverted for criminal purposes. Healthcare professionals have access to vulnerable populations and possess knowledge that can be used to exploit or harm patients, Dr. Kim noted. Our licensing and oversight procedures had to evolve to address these realities and protect public safety. The case had also influenced medical education curricula throughout Arizona, with enhanced ethics training that specifically addressed the potential for medical authority to be abused and the professional obligations that healthcare providers had to report suspected abuse or exploitation of vulnerable patients. 10 years after the initial investigation, the Phoenix Police Department had become recognized as a national leader in trafficking investigation and prevention. The department regularly hosted training programs for law enforcement agencies from other jurisdictions, sharing the investigative techniques and community partnership models that had been developed in response to the Herrera case. The department's trafficking unit had grown from a small specialized team to a comprehensive program that included investigators, victim advocates, community liaisons, and prevention specialists. This expansion reflected both the increased recognition of trafficking as a significant criminal problem and the success of Phoenix's multifaceted approach to addressing these crimes. Lieutenant Martinez, who now supervised the expanded trafficking unit, had become a nationally recognized expert in trafficking investigation and victim services. Her experience with the Herrera case had informed her approach to training other law enforcement professionals and had contributed to the development of best practices that were being adopted by agencies throughout the country. The Herrera case taught us that effective trafficking response requires more than just good investigation techniques, Lieutenant Martinez explained during a presentation to the National Association of Police Chiefs. It requires community partnerships, specialized victim services, and a comprehensive understanding of the psychological techniques used by sophisticated criminal networks. Our success comes from treating trafficking as a community problem that requires a community response. The case had also influenced federal policy on trafficking prevention and prosecution, contributing to enhanced funding for specialized units and survivor services. The success of Phoenix's approach had been studied by federal agencies and had informed the development of grant programs that supported similar initiatives in other jurisdictions. The Department of Justice had used the Herrera case as a model for training federal prosecutors on trafficking cases involving religious manipulation and psychological coercion. The legal strategies developed during the prosecution had been incorporated into federal training programs and had influenced the development of enhanced trafficking statutes that specifically addressed the use of religious authority and medical knowledge to exploit victims. The case had also contributed to international efforts to combat trafficking, with representatives from the Phoenix investigation participating in United Nations working groups focused on developing global standards for identifying and prosecuting sophisticated trafficking operations. The psychological techniques documented in the Herrera case had been recognized as part of a broader evolution in trafficking methods that required enhanced international cooperation and specialized investigative approaches. 15 years after the initial investigation, Detective Ramirez had been promoted to captain and assigned to oversee the Phoenix Police Department's entire Special Victims Division, which included units focused on trafficking, domestic violence, child abuse, and sexual assault. His experience with the Herrera case had shaped his approach to managing complex investigations, and had influenced the department's broader strategy for addressing crimes against vulnerable populations. The Herrera case was a watershed moment for our department and our community, Captain Ramirez reflected, during an interview marking the anniversary of the investigation. It taught us that modern criminal operations are sophisticated enterprises that require equally sophisticated responses. We can't just react to individual incidents, we have to understand the broader networks and systems that enable exploitation and develop comprehensive strategies to disrupt them. The Phoenix model for trafficking response had been adopted by cities throughout the Southwest and had influenced national policy on trafficking prevention and prosecution. The success of the community partnership approach had demonstrated that effective trafficking response required coordination between law enforcement, social services, healthcare providers, religious organizations, and immigrant advocacy groups. The annual conference on trafficking prevention hosted by the Phoenix Police Department drew participants from throughout North America, providing a forum for sharing best practices and discussing emerging trends in trafficking methods and investigation techniques. The conference had become one of the premier professional development opportunities for law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and service providers working on trafficking cases. The transformation of the apartment building where Herrera had operated into transitional housing for trafficking survivors had become a symbol of Phoenix's commitment to converting sites of exploitation into resources for recovery and healing. The building now housed up to 30 survivors at a time, providing safe, affordable accommodation along with comprehensive support services, including counseling, job training, legal assistance, and health care. The building's transformation had been funded through a combination of asset forfeiture proceeds from trafficking prosecutions, federal grants, and private donations from community members who had been moved by the stories of survivors and their recovery journeys. The project had demonstrated how criminal assets could be repurposed to benefit victims and strengthen community resources for preventing future exploitation. Maria Santos, the woman whose apartment had been the site of Herrera's operation, had become one of the building's first residents after her own recovery from the trauma of discovering how her home had been used for systematic abuse. Her journey from unwitting landlord to survivor advocate illustrated the complex ways that trafficking operations impacted entire communities, not just direct victims. I thought I was just renting an apartment to a religious group, Santos explained during a community meeting about trafficking prevention. I had no idea that I was providing space for systematic abuse and exploitation. The experience taught me that we all have a responsibility to pay attention to what's happening in our communities and to speak up when something doesn't seem right. Santos had become a volunteer with Phoenix's trafficking prevention program, using her experience to help property owners and neighbors recognize signs of potential trafficking operations. Her work focused on education and awareness building, helping community members understand how legitimate businesses and housing could be exploited by criminal networks. The community education programs that had been developed in response to the Herrera case had reached thousands of Phoenix residents, providing information about trafficking indicators and resources for reporting suspected cases. These programs were conducted in multiple languages and were tailored to different community groups, recognizing that trafficking operations often targeted specific populations based on language, immigration status, or cultural vulnerabilities. The success of community education efforts was measured through increased reporting of suspected trafficking activities and improved outcomes for victims who were identified through community tips rather than law enforcement investigation. Community members who had been educated about trafficking indicators were more likely to recognize problematic situations and more comfortable reporting their concerns to appropriate authorities. Dr. Rodriguez's research on the psychological techniques used in the Herrera case had contributed to a broader understanding of how trafficking operations used religious and medical authority to control victims. Her work had been published in academic journals and had influenced the development of treatment protocols for survivors recovering from cult-like manipulation combined with trafficking exploitation. The research had also contributed to enhanced training programs for mental health professionals, helping therapists and counselors recognize and address the unique psychological impact of trafficking combined with religious manipulation. These training programs had improved treatment outcomes for survivors and had helped identify additional victims who had been exploited by similar operations. The Phoenix Children's Hospital had established a specialized program for treating young people who had been victims of trafficking operations that used family-based manipulation and control. The program recognized that children and adolescents who had been exploited through family networks or pseudo-religious organizations required different treatment approaches than adult victims, or those who had been trafficked through more traditional methods. Dr. Lisa Kim, who directed the Pediatric Trafficking Recovery Program, had worked with several young people who had been exposed to Herrera's operation through family connections or community relationships. Her experience had contributed to the development of treatment protocols that addressed both the direct trauma of exploitation and the complex family dynamics that had enabled the abuse. Children who are trafficked through family or community networks face unique challenges because the people who should have protected them were often complicit in their exploitation, Dr. Kim explained. Recovery requires not just trauma treatment, but also helping these young people develop healthy relationships and trust systems that may have been completely absent from their previous experiences. The success of specialized treatment programs for trafficking survivors had attracted national attention and had led to the development of similar programs in other cities. Phoenix's comprehensive approach to survivor services had become a model for communities throughout the country that were developing their own responses to trafficking and exploitation. The federal funding that had supported the expansion of Phoenix's trafficking response programs had been renewed multiple times, reflecting the success of the city's approach and the ongoing need for specialized services. The funding had enabled the expansion of survivor housing, enhanced law enforcement training, and the development of prevention programs that reached vulnerable populations before they became victims of trafficking operations. The success of Phoenix's trafficking response had also attracted private foundation support, with several national organizations providing grants to expand successful programs and replicate them in other jurisdictions. The combination of federal funding and private support had enabled Phoenix to become a center of excellence for trafficking prevention and response, influencing policy and practice throughout the region. The annual Survivor Leadership Conference, hosted by Phoenix, brought together trafficking survivors from throughout the country to share their experiences, advocate for policy changes, and provide input on service programs. The conference had become an important venue for survivor voices to influence the development of trafficking response policies and programs. The conference participants included individuals who had been trafficked through various methods and had recovered through different types of intervention and support. Their diverse experiences provided valuable insights into the range of trafficking operations and the variety of approaches needed to effectively identify, investigate, and prosecute these crimes. Anna Rodriguez, who had become a nationally recognized survivor advocate, served as the conference coordinator and had worked to ensure that survivor voices were centered in discussions about trafficking policy and response. Her leadership had helped shift the focus of trafficking discussions from law enforcement perspectives to survivor-centered approaches that prioritized victim recovery and empowerment. Survivors are the real experts on trafficking, Rodriguez explained during one of the conference presentations. We understand how these operations work, what victims need to recover, and what communities can do to prevent exploitation. Our voices need to be central to any discussion about how to address trafficking effectively. The influence of survivor advocacy had led to significant changes in how trafficking cases were investigated and prosecuted, with enhanced protections for victim privacy, improved coordination between law enforcement and victim services, and recognition that successful prosecutions required long-term support for survivors who testified against their traffickers. The Phoenix model for survivor-centered trafficking response had been adopted by federal agencies and had influenced the development of national standards for trafficking victim identification and services. The approach recognized that effective trafficking response required treating victims as partners in the investigation and prosecution process rather than simply as sources of evidence. 20 years after the initial Herrera investigation, Phoenix had become recognized as one of the most effective cities in the country for trafficking prevention and response. The city's comprehensive approach had resulted in the identification and prosecution of dozens of trafficking operations, the recovery of hundreds of survivors, and the development of prevention programs that had reached thousands of vulnerable community members. The success of Phoenix's approach had been studied by researchers and policymakers from throughout the world, contributing to international efforts to develop effective responses to modern trafficking operations. The city had hosted delegations from numerous countries seeking to learn from Phoenix's experience and adapt successful strategies to their own contexts. The long-term impact of the Herrera case extended far beyond the original investigation and prosecution. The case had catalyzed a transformation in how Phoenix understood and responded to trafficking, leading to the development of comprehensive programs that addressed prevention, identification, investigation, prosecution, and survivor recovery as interconnected elements of an effective anti-trafficking strategy. Detective Ramirez, now approaching retirement after a career that had been shaped by his experience with the Herrera case, reflected on the broader lessons that had emerged from the investigation. His initial response to what appeared to be a routine domestic disturbance call had evolved into a decades-long commitment to protecting vulnerable populations from sophisticated criminal exploitation. The Herrera case taught me that effective law enforcement requires understanding the broader social conditions that enable exploitation and developing responses that address root causes rather than just individual crimes, Ramirez observed. We can't just arrest our way out of trafficking. We have to build communities where exploitation becomes impossible because everyone is connected to support systems and everyone is watching out for their neighbors. The community partnerships that had been essential to the success of Phoenix's trafficking response had evolved into broader collaboratives focused on addressing multiple forms of exploitation and abuse. These partnerships recognized that trafficking often co-occurred with other forms of violence and exploitation, requiring comprehensive approaches that addressed the full range of threats facing vulnerable populations. The Phoenix Community Safety Collaborative brought together representatives from law enforcement, social services, healthcare, education, religious organizations, and advocacy groups to coordinate responses to violence and exploitation. The collaborative had become a model for how communities could organize comprehensive responses to complex social problems that required multi-sector coordination. The collaborative's success was measured not just in the number of trafficking cases identified and prosecuted, but in broader indicators of community safety and resilience. The partnerships had contributed to reduced crime rates, improved outcomes for vulnerable populations, and stronger social connections that served as protective factors against various forms of exploitation and abuse. The legacy of the Herrera case continued to influence Phoenix's approach to public safety and community development decades after the original investigation. The case had demonstrated that effective crime prevention required addressing the social conditions that created vulnerability, while successful prosecution required community partnerships that could provide comprehensive support for victims and survivors. For the officers who continued to work Phoenix's night shifts, the lessons of the Herrera case remained relevant and influential. The investigation had established protocols and partnerships that enabled officers to recognize and respond to complex criminal operations while providing appropriate resources for victims who needed specialized support and services. The night shift briefings that preceded each tour of duty continued to include references to the Herrera case and the lessons that had been learned from the investigation. New officers were taught to recognize the signs of systematic exploitation and to understand their role in broader community efforts to prevent trafficking and support survivors. Officer Jessica Martinez, no relation to the original Officer Martinez, who had joined the Phoenix Police Department 15 years after the Herrera case, represented the new generation of officers whose training incorporated decades of learning from trafficking investigations. Her academy classes had included extensive modules on trafficking psychology, community partnerships, and survivor-centered approaches to victim services. The Herrera case is still taught as the foundational example of how a routine call can reveal complex criminal operations, Officer Martinez explained during a training session for new recruits. We learned from that case every day, and it continues to influence how we approach our work and our relationships with the community we serve. The training programs that had been developed from the Herrera case had been adopted by the Phoenix Police Department's night shift operations had been permanently transformed by the lessons learned from the Herrera case. Officers working graveyard shifts understood that their work involved more than responding to individual calls. They were part of a comprehensive community safety network that included prevention, intervention, investigation, and long-term support for survivors of exploitation. The darkness that had once concealed Herrera's systematic abuse of vulnerable women now sheltered a comprehensive network of services and partnerships designed to identify and disrupt trafficking operations while providing hope and healing for survivors. The night shift officers who patrolled Phoenix's streets understood that their vigilance and community connections were essential components of a system that had transformed tragedy into triumph and had made Phoenix a model for communities throughout the world. For Captain Ramirez, approaching the end of a career that had been defined by his commitment to protecting vulnerable populations, the Herrera case remained the most significant and influential investigation of his professional life. The case had taught him that effective law enforcement required not just technical skills and investigative techniques, but also community engagement, cultural competence, and a deep understanding of the social conditions that enabled exploitation and abuse. The Herrera case changed everything about how I understood my role as a police officer, Captain Ramirez reflected during his retirement ceremony. It taught me that protecting and serving meant more than responding to calls and making arrests. It meant building relationships, understanding communities, and working with partners throughout the community to address the conditions that enable crime and exploitation. The Phoenix Police Department's response to the Herrera case had become a model for how law enforcement agencies could evolve and adapt to address sophisticated criminal operations while maintaining community trust and engagement. The case had demonstrated that effective policing required not just law enforcement expertise, but also collaboration with diverse community partners who brought different perspectives and resources to public safety challenges. The Memorial Garden, established for trafficking survivors, included a special section dedicated to the victims of the Herrera operation, along with representatives from trafficking operations that had been dismantled through investigations inspired by the original case. The garden served as both a tribute to survivors and a reminder of the ongoing need for community vigilance and law enforcement dedication to protecting vulnerable populations. The garden had become a gathering place for survivors, their families, community advocates, and law enforcement officers who had worked on trafficking cases. Annual memorial services brought together diverse groups of people who had been affected by trafficking in different ways, creating opportunities for healing, reflection, and continued commitment to prevention and survivor support. For for the survivors of Herrera's operation who had rebuilt their lives and become advocates for others, the memorial garden represented both the tragedy they had experienced and the hope that had emerged from their recovery. Their transformation from victims to leaders demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit and the power of comprehensive support systems to enable healing and growth. The legacy of the Herrera case extended far beyond the original investigation to influence how communities throughout the country understood and responded to trafficking. The case had demonstrated that effective anti-trafficking efforts required long-term commitment, comprehensive approaches, and recognition that trafficking was not just a law enforcement problem, but a community challenge that required broad-based solutions. 25 years after the initial investigation, the impact of the Herrera case continued to influence policy and practice in ways that extended far beyond Phoenix and far beyond trafficking. The case had become a foundational example of how communities could organize comprehensive responses to complex social problems while maintaining focus on the needs and rights of those who had been most directly affected by violence and exploitation. The officers who worked Phoenix's night shifts understood that they were part of a legacy that had transformed tragedy into progress and had made their community a model for others facing similar challenges. The darkness that had once concealed systematic abuse now sheltered a network of services, partnerships, and community connections that served as a beacon of hope for vulnerable populations and a model for communities throughout the world, seeking to protect their most vulnerable members from sophisticated criminal exploitation. The neon glow of Las Vegas Boulevard cast an artificial dawn across Officer Marcus Rodriguez's patrol car windshield as he navigated through the 3:17 a.m. traffic that never seemed to thin, even on a Tuesday night in October 2024. The Strip was alive with its usual collection of tourists, street performers, and the kind of people who emerged from the shadows when honest folks were sleeping. But something felt different tonight. Rodriguez had been working the graveyard shift in Metro's Tourist Safety Division for 6 years, long enough to develop an instinct for when the city's carefully manufactured glamour was hiding something darker than the usual pickpockets and drunk college kids. His radio crackled with the familiar voice of Sergeant Patricia Chen from dispatch. Unit 47. We've got reports of suspicious activity at the Mirage parking garage, Level 3. Security cameras caught someone moving between vehicles with what appears to be electronic equipment. Possible vehicle break-ins in progress. Rodriguez acknowledged the call and turned his patrol car toward the massive resort complex, its signature volcano dormant in the pre-dawn hours. The Mirage's parking garage was a multi-level maze that could hide a dozen different crimes simultaneously, and Rodriguez had responded to everything from car thefts to drug deals to the occasional body dump in its shadowy corners. But as he approached the entrance, his trained eye caught something that made him slow down and really look at what he was seeing. A figure in dark clothing was indeed moving systematically between parked cars, but they weren't breaking windows or jimmying locks. Instead, they appeared to be attaching small devices to vehicles, devices that caught the garage's fluorescent lighting in a way that suggested sophisticated electronics rather than crude theft tools. More concerning was the methodical nature of the person's movement, working through the rows of cars with the precision of someone following a detailed plan rather than opportunistically grabbing whatever looked valuable. Rodriguez parked his patrol car at the garage entrance and called for backup before approaching on foot, following protocol for potential vehicle theft investigations. But as he moved closer to the suspect's location, what he observed challenged every assumption about routine property crime that his 6 years of patrol experience had taught him to recognize. The suspect was a woman in her 30s, dressed in black tactical clothing and wearing latex gloves that suggested professional criminal activity rather than amateur theft. She carried a leather satchel filled with electronic devices that looked more sophisticated than anything Rodriguez had seen in typical car break-ins. Most disturbing was the way she seemed to be selecting specific vehicles. Not the expensive luxury cars that attracted most thieves, but ordinary sedans and SUVs that wouldn't normally draw criminal attention. Rodriguez positioned himself behind a concrete pillar and observed the suspect's activities while waiting for backup to arrive. What he saw made him realize he wasn't dealing with car theft at all, but something much more complex and potentially dangerous. The woman was attaching GPS tracking devices to selected vehicles, photographing license plates, and making notes in a small notebook that suggested systematic surveillance rather than random criminal activity. When backup arrived in the form of Officer Jennifer Walsh, a 4-year veteran who had transferred to tourist safety from robbery homicide, Rodriguez briefed her quickly on what he'd observed. Walsh's experience with organized crime investigations immediately recognized the signs of professional surveillance operations that went far beyond simple vehicle theft. "Rodriguez, this isn't about stealing cars," Walsh whispered as they prepared to approach the suspect. "She's conducting systematic surveillance on specific targets. The question is why and who's paying for this level of sophistication." They approached the suspect from different angles, using the concrete pillars and parked cars for cover, while maintaining visual contact with each other. The woman was so focused on her activities that she didn't notice their approach until Rodriguez announced their presence with his weapon drawn, but pointed at the ground. "Metro Police, stop what you're doing and step away from the vehicle." The woman's reaction was immediate and professional. She didn't run, panic, or attempt to dispose of evidence like a typical street criminal. Instead, she slowly raised her hands and stepped back from the vehicle she'd been working on, her body language suggesting someone who had been trained to handle law enforcement encounters. "Officers, I can explain what I'm doing here," she said in accented English that Rodriguez couldn't immediately place. "I'm a private investigator working on an insurance fraud case. I have identification and documentation in my bag." Rodriguez and Walsh exchanged glances that communicated their shared skepticism. Private investigators didn't typically work alone in parking garages at 3:30 a.m., and the sophisticated surveillance equipment suggested resources beyond what most legitimate PI operations could afford. "Ma'am, we're going to need to see that identification," Walsh said, "and we'll need you to explain why you're attaching tracking devices to vehicles without the owner's knowledge or consent." The woman reached slowly into her jacket and produced a California private investigator's license, identifying her as Elena Vasquez, licensed to Precision Investigations of Los Angeles. But as Rodriguez examined the license under his flashlight, he noticed several details that suggested the document might be forged or obtained under false pretenses. "Ms. Vasquez," Rodriguez said, "private investigators are required to notify local law enforcement when conducting surveillance operations in our jurisdiction. We have no record of any PI notifications for this location or time frame." Vasquez's composure slipped slightly, and Rodriguez caught a flash of something in her expression that suggested she was calculating her options rather than cooperating with legitimate law enforcement. Her hand moved almost imperceptibly toward her satchel, and Walsh immediately recognized the movement as potentially threatening. "Ma'am, step away from the bag and put your hands where we can see them," Walsh commanded, her weapon now raised to ready position. "Rodriguez, check the satchel for weapons." What Rodriguez found in Vasquez's equipment bag would transform a routine suspicious activity call into one of the most complex criminal investigations in Las Vegas Metro's history. Along with the GPS tracking devices and surveillance equipment, the bag contained photographs of over 30 individuals, detailed personal information including home addresses and work schedules, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be architectural plans for several major strip resorts. The photographs showed people who appeared to be casino employees, hotel staff, and security personnel from multiple properties along the strip. Each photo was accompanied by typed notes containing personal information that could only have been obtained through extensive surveillance or illegal access to employment records. Names, addresses, shift schedules, family information, and what appeared to be assessments of each individual's potential vulnerabilities were documented with the thoroughness of a professional intelligence operation. But it was the architectural plans that made Rodriguez realize they were dealing with something far more serious than surveillance or insurance fraud. The documents showed detailed floor plans for employee areas, security checkpoints, cash handling facilities, and surveillance camera blind spots for the Mirage, Bellagio, Caesar's Palace, and 4 other major strip properties. Walsh, we need to call this in to Robbery Homicide and Intelligence Division immediately, Rodriguez said as he documented the evidence with his body camera. This looks like reconnaissance for major casino heists or terrorist attacks. Vasquez remained silent during the evidence inventory, invoking her right to an attorney when questioned about the materials found in her possession. But her professional demeanor and the sophisticated nature of her operation suggested she was part of a larger criminal enterprise with resources and capabilities that extended far beyond individual criminal activity. Detective Captain Sarah Kim from Metro's Intelligence Division arrived 30 minutes later, accompanied by specialists from the FBI's Las Vegas field office who had been monitoring potential threats to the Strip's gaming and tourism infrastructure. Captain Kim had 15 years of experience investigating organized crime operations that targeted Las Vegas casinos, but the sophistication of Vasquez's surveillance operation was unlike anything she had encountered in her career. This level of intelligence gathering suggests months of preparation and significant financial backing, Captain Kim explained to Rodriguez and Walsh as they processed the crime scene. The architectural plans alone would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to obtain through legitimate channels, and the personal information on casino employees could only come from extensive surveillance or infiltration of casino security systems. The FBI agents, led by Special Agent Robert Chen, no relation to Sergeant Chen from Dispatch, immediately recognized the potential national security implications of the operation. The combination of detailed facility plans, employee vulnerability assessments, and sophisticated surveillance equipment suggested either a major criminal conspiracy or potential terrorist reconnaissance that could threaten thousands of tourists and casino workers. We're treating this as a potential threat to critical infrastructure, Agent Chen explained to the Metro officers. The casinos on the Strip process over $10 billion annually and host millions of international visitors. Any successful attack on these facilities would have economic and security implications that extend far beyond Las Vegas. The interrogation of Elena Vasquez required specialized techniques designed to break through the psychological conditioning that suggested professional training in counter-interrogation methods. Dr. Patricia Martinez, a forensic psychologist who specialized in interviewing subjects with military or intelligence backgrounds, was brought in to assist with questioning that might reveal the scope and objectives of the surveillance operation. Dr. Martinez's initial assessment suggested that Vasquez had been trained by professionals in surveillance techniques, operational security, and resistance to interrogation. Her responses to questioning followed patterns typically associated with military or intelligence training, suggesting she was either a former government operative or had been trained by someone with that background. Vasquez is operating under what appears to be a professional operational framework, Dr. Martinez explained to the investigation team. Her surveillance methods, equipment selection, and response to arrest all suggest systematic training rather than criminal improvisation. We're dealing with someone who views this as a mission rather than a crime. The breakthrough in the investigation came when forensic specialists analyzed the metadata from the digital photographs found in Vasquez's possession. The images had been taken over a period of 6 months, using multiple cameras and from locations that suggested extensive reconnaissance of casino security measures and employee routines. More importantly, several images contained background details that revealed they had been taken from inside casino properties, indicating that Vasquez or her associates had successfully infiltrated casino security systems. The metadata analysis also revealed that the photographs had been transmitted to IP addresses in 3 different countries, suggesting an international operation with coordination and command structures that extended far beyond Las Vegas. The FBI's Cybercrime Division immediately began tracing these communications while working with international law enforcement partners to identify potential co-conspirators and command elements. But the most disturbing discovery came when investigators realized that several of the casino employees photographed by Vasquez had reported suspicious approaches in the weeks preceding her arrest. Security personnel, dealers, and hotel staff from multiple properties had been contacted by individuals claiming to represent employee benefit programs, insurance companies, or union organizations. These contacts had been used to gather personal information and assess employee loyalty and vulnerability to recruitment or coercion. Detective Rodriguez coordinated with casino security departments to identify employees who had been targeted by the operation and assess whether any had been successfully recruited or compromised. This investigation revealed that at least 12 casino employees across 6 properties had been approached by operatives connected to Vasquez's organization, with 3 admitting they had provided information about security procedures in exchange for what they believed were legitimate employment opportunities. The scope of the conspiracy expanded dramatically when federal investigators discovered that Vasquez's operation was part of a larger network targeting major gambling and entertainment venues throughout the western United States. Similar surveillance activities had been reported in Atlantic City, Reno, and tribal casinos in California and Arizona, suggesting a coordinated effort to gather intelligence on casino security systems across multiple jurisdictions. Agent Chen coordinated with FBI field offices in affected cities to compare intelligence and identify patterns that might reveal the ultimate objectives of the surveillance network. What emerged was evidence of the most sophisticated casino heist conspiracy in American history, involving international criminal organizations with the resources and expertise to target multiple high-value facilities simultaneously. We're not looking at individual casino robberies, Agent Chen explained during a briefing with Metro Command staff and casino security executives. This appears to be planned as a coordinated attack on multiple facilities, possibly timed to maximize both financial impact and psychological effect on the gambling industry. The investigation revealed that the criminal network had been studying casino security systems, employee schedules, cash handling procedures, and law enforcement response protocols for over 2 years. The level of detail in their intelligence gathering suggested they were planning operations that would require split-second timing and intimate knowledge of each facility's vulnerabilities and defensive capabilities. Rodriguez found himself assigned as the primary liaison between Metro patrol officers and the federal task force investigating the conspiracy. His initial arrest of Vasquez had provided the crucial breakthrough that exposed the broader network, and his knowledge of Strip Patrol operations made him valuable to investigators trying to understand how the surveillance had been conducted without detection by casino security or law enforcement. The thing that bothers me most about this case, Rodriguez told Walsh during one of their debriefing sessions, is how long they were operating right under our noses. We patrol those casino properties every night. and none of us noticed sophisticated surveillance operations that had been going on for months. Walsh nodded, understanding the professional concern that came with realizing how easily their security measures had been penetrated. Rodriguez, they were professionals using techniques designed to avoid detection by people like us. The fact that you recognized something was wrong when you saw Vasquez in that parking garage probably prevented whatever they were planning from succeeding. The federal investigation eventually identified a network of 37 individuals operating across 8 states, all coordinated by what appeared to be an international criminal organization with connections to Eastern European organized crime groups, specializing in high-tech casino fraud and theft operations. The network included former military personnel, discharged security professionals, and individuals with backgrounds in casino operations who provided inside knowledge of facility procedures and vulnerabilities. Vasquez, faced with federal charges that could result in life imprisonment, eventually agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her debriefing revealed that the network had been planning coordinated heists targeting 5 major strip casinos during the week between Christmas and New Year's, when holiday crowds would provide cover for the operations while maximizing the amount of cash and valuables available for theft. The plan was elegant in its complexity, Agent Chen explained to the task force. They would have used their inside knowledge of security procedures to disable alarm systems, their surveillance of employee schedules to time the operations when staff would be minimal, and their architectural intelligence to plan escape routes that avoided casino security and law enforcement response. The heists were designed to appear as inside jobs conducted by casino employees, using the personal information gathered through surveillance to frame innocent workers for the crimes while the actual perpetrators escaped with millions of dollars in cash, chips, and jewelry from high-roller gaming areas and luxury retail outlets within the casino complexes. But the most chilling aspect of the plan was its potential for violence. Vasquez revealed that the network had acquired military-grade weapons and were prepared to use force against security personnel and law enforcement officers who might interfere with their operations. The holiday timing would have maximized civilian casualties if the heists had escalated into armed confrontations within the crowded casino environments. The arrests of network members required coordination between FBI field offices in 8 cities, with simultaneous raids designed to prevent suspects from destroying evidence or fleeing to countries without extradition treaties. The operation, codenamed House Edge, resulted in the largest casino crime prosecution in federal history and the disruption of criminal networks that had been targeting gambling facilities throughout North America and Europe. Rodriguez testified as the primary witness in the federal trials that followed, describing his observations during the initial arrest and explaining how patrol officers could recognize signs of professional surveillance operations. His testimony was crucial in establishing the timeline and methods used by the network, while also highlighting the importance of patrol-level intelligence gathering in detecting sophisticated criminal operations. The trials revealed the international scope of casino-targeted organized crime and the sophisticated methods used by criminal networks to gather intelligence and plan complex heists. Expert witnesses included former intelligence operatives, casino security specialists, and organized crime prosecutors who explained how legitimate surveillance techniques could be perverted for criminal purposes. Vasquez received a 15-year federal sentence after her cooperation helped convict higher-level members of the network and prevented the planned holiday heists that could have resulted in hundreds of casualties and tens of millions of dollars in losses. Her testimony provided crucial insights into how international criminal organizations recruited and trained operatives for casino-targeting crimes. The investigation had far-reaching consequences for casino security throughout the United States. New protocols were implemented for employee background checks, surveillance system upgrades, and coordination between casino security departments and law enforcement agencies. The sophistication of the Vasquez network's reconnaissance capabilities forced the gambling industry to reassess its security assumptions and invest in enhanced protective measures. For Rodriguez, the case fundamentally changed his understanding of patrol work and the types of criminal activity that could be hidden within the routine activities of a major tourist destination. His role in exposing the network earned him a promotion to detective and assignment to Metro's newly expanded Casino Crimes Unit, where he specialized in investigating sophisticated fraud and theft operations targeting gaming facilities. The Vasquez case taught me that effective patrol work requires looking beyond the obvious and questioning activities that seem routine but don't quite fit normal patterns, Rodriguez explained during training sessions for new officers. Professional criminals are sophisticated and patient, willing to spend months or years preparing for major crimes. Our job is to recognize the signs of that preparation before it becomes action. The case also highlighted the importance of information sharing between law enforcement agencies and private security organizations. The casino industry's cooperation with federal investigators had been essential in identifying the scope of the network and preventing the planned heists, demonstrating that effective crime prevention required partnerships that extended beyond traditional law enforcement boundaries. Metro's Intelligence Division established a permanent liaison program with Strip casino security departments, creating communication channels that enabled rapid sharing of information about suspicious activities and potential threats. This program became a model for law enforcement partnerships with private security organizations in other major tourist destinations. 5 years after the initial arrest, Las Vegas had become recognized as having some of the most sophisticated casino security systems in the world, partly in response to the Vasquez network's demonstrated capabilities. The enhancements included advanced surveillance technology, improved employee screening procedures, and enhanced coordination between casino security and law enforcement agencies. Detective Rodriguez, now a sergeant supervising Metro's Casino Crimes Unit, continued to work night shifts throughout the Strip, but with an enhanced understanding of the complex criminal threats facing major tourism destinations. His unit had investigated dozens of sophisticated fraud and theft operations, many of which used techniques similar to those pioneered by the Vasquez network. The Vasquez case was a wake-up call for everyone involved in casino security, Sergeant Rodriguez reflected during an interview marking the 5th anniversary of the investigation. It showed us that we were facing criminals with resources and capabilities we hadn't previously encountered, and that our security measures needed to evolve to address these new threats. The annual conference on casino security, hosted by Las Vegas Metro, drew law enforcement professionals from gaming jurisdictions throughout the world, sharing intelligence and best practices for detecting and preventing sophisticated criminal operations targeting gambling facilities. The conference had become one of the premier professional development opportunities for officers specializing in casino-related crimes. The transformation of casino security in response to the Vasquez network had implications that extended beyond the gambling industry. The surveillance techniques and intelligence gathering methods used by the network were subsequently employed by criminals targeting other high-value facilities, including airports, sports venues, and major retail complexes, requiring law enforcement agencies to develop broader capabilities for detecting professional reconnaissance activities. Dr. Martinez's research on the psychological profiles of individuals recruited by sophisticated criminal networks contributed to enhanced screening procedures for positions involving access to sensitive facilities and information. Her work helped identify personality traits and backgrounds that made individuals vulnerable to recruitment by organized crime groups, leading to improved security clearance procedures and employee monitoring programs. The federal sentences imposed on network members ranged from 8 years to life imprisonment, reflecting both the severity of their planned crimes and their cooperation with ongoing investigations into international organized crime activities. Several defendants provided information that led to the disruption of criminal networks in Eastern Europe and South America, extending the impact of the investigation far beyond the original Las Vegas operation. Vasquez, after serving her federal sentence, was deported to her country of origin and placed under surveillance by international law enforcement agencies monitoring her activities and associations. Her cooperation with American investigators had provided valuable intelligence about criminal training methods and operational procedures, but also made her a potential target for retribution by criminal organizations whose operations had been disrupted. The architectural plans and facility intelligence gathered by the Vasquez network were used by casino security consultants to identify and address vulnerabilities in existing security systems. This information led to significant upgrades in access control systems, surveillance coverage, and emergency response procedures at gambling facilities throughout the United States and internationally. The case also influenced federal legislation addressing criminal surveillance of critical infrastructure facilities, with enhanced penalties for individuals or organizations conducting unauthorized reconnaissance of facilities that serve large numbers of civilians. The Vasquez network's capabilities had demonstrated that traditional trespass and surveillance laws were inadequate for addressing sophisticated intelligence-gathering operations conducted by professional criminals. 10 years after the initial investigation, the Metro Police Department's night shift operations had been permanently enhanced by lessons learned from the casino security case. Officers working graveyard shifts understood that their patrol areas included facilities that attracted sophisticated international criminal attention, requiring enhanced observational skills and knowledge of professional surveillance techniques. The training programs developed from the Vasquez case had been adopted by law enforcement agencies throughout Nevada and had influenced national standards for patrol officer education regarding organized crime recognition and intelligence gathering. The case continued to serve as a primary example of how routine patrol work could intersect with complex international criminal operations. Officer Jennifer Walsh, who had assisted with the original arrest, had been promoted to detective and assigned to Metro's Financial Crimes Unit, where she specialized in investigating money laundering operations connected to casino activities. Her experience with the Vasquez case had provided insights into how criminal organizations moved and concealed funds obtained through gambling-related crimes. The Vasquez network showed us that modern organized crime operations are essentially businesses with sophisticated planning, professional training, and international resources, Detective Walsh explained during a training seminar for patrol officers. Our response has to be equally professional and coordinated, which means every officer needs to understand how their patrol observations might contribute to larger investigations. The success of Metro's casino security initiatives had attracted federal funding for expanded intelligence capabilities and enhanced cooperation with international law enforcement agencies. Las Vegas had become a center of excellence for investigating organized crime operations, targeting gambling and tourism infrastructure, influencing policy and practice throughout the region. The FBI's Las Vegas field office had established a permanent casino crimes task force that included representatives from Metro, casino security departments, and federal agencies responsible for protecting critical infrastructure. This task force served as a model for multi-agency cooperation in addressing complex criminal threats to major economic and tourism centers. Special Agent Chen, who had coordinated the federal investigation, had been promoted to supervise the Bureau's organized crime operations throughout the western United States. His experience with the Vasquez network had contributed to enhanced FBI capabilities for investigating international criminal organizations operating within American territory. The Vasquez case demonstrated that the line between organized crime and international security threats is increasingly blurred. Agent Chen explained during a congressional hearing on casino security. Criminal organizations, with the resources and capabilities we encountered in Las Vegas, pose challenges that require coordinated responses from law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and private security organizations. The memorial, established for law enforcement officers who had worked on casino security cases, included recognition of the Vasquez investigation's contribution to protecting civilian populations from sophisticated criminal operations. The memorial served as a reminder of the ongoing threats facing major tourism destinations and the dedication required to maintain security in environments that attracted both legitimate visitors and professional criminals. 15 years after the initial arrest, Sergeant Rodriguez had been promoted to lieutenant and assigned to oversee Metro's entire Special Operations Division, which included units focused on casino crimes, tourist safety, and organized crime investigation. His career had been shaped by the lessons learned from his encounter with Elena Vasquez in a parking garage that had seemed like a routine suspicious activity call. The Vasquez case taught me that there's no such thing as a routine call when you're working in an environment that attracts international attention and significant financial activity, Lieutenant Rodriguez reflected during his promotion ceremony. Every patrol officer needs to understand that they might encounter sophisticated criminal operations disguised as normal activity, and their observations could be crucial to preventing major crimes or terrorist attacks. The Las Vegas model for casino security had been adopted by gambling jurisdictions throughout the world, with particular emphasis on the intelligence sharing and multi-agency cooperation techniques developed in response to the Vasquez network. International conferences on gaming security regularly featured presentations about the Las Vegas experience and its implications for protecting gambling facilities in different cultural and legal contexts. The ongoing evolution of casino security in response to changing criminal threats continued to require enhanced training for law enforcement officers and security personnel. New technologies, international criminal methodologies, and terrorist tactics required constant adaptation of protective measures and investigative techniques. For the officers who continued to work Las Vegas Metro's night shifts, the legacy of the Vasquez case remained influential in their approach to patrol work and community protection. The investigation had demonstrated that sophisticated criminals could operate within tourist destinations for extended periods without detection, requiring constant vigilance and professional development to maintain effective security. The darkness that had once concealed Elena Vasquez's surveillance activities now sheltered enhanced security measures and intelligence capabilities designed to detect and disrupt criminal operations before they could threaten civilian populations. The night shift officers who patrolled the Strip understood that their work involved protecting not just individual tourists, but the economic and social infrastructure that supported one of America's most important tourism destinations. The neon glow that had provided cover for criminal reconnaissance now illuminated a comprehensive security network that included surveillance systems, intelligence analysis, and law enforcement partnerships designed to identify and neutralize threats before they could develop into successful criminal operations. The transformation of Las Vegas casino security had created a model for protecting other high-value targets from sophisticated criminal organizations with international resources and capabilities. 20 years after Sergeant Rodriguez first observed Elena Vasquez attaching tracking devices to vehicles in the Mirage parking garage, Las Vegas had become recognized as one of the most secure major tourism destinations in the world. The city's response to the casino heist conspiracy had created security innovations and law enforcement partnerships that influenced protective measures throughout the tourism and entertainment industries. The officers who worked Metro's night shifts understood that they were part of a legacy that had transformed a major criminal threat into enhanced community security and international cooperation. The investigation that began with routine patrol work had evolved into comprehensive security improvements that protected millions of visitors while serving as a model for other destinations, facing similar challenges from sophisticated international criminal organizations. For Lieutenant Rodriguez, approaching the end of a career that had been defined by his commitment to protecting tourists and casino workers from organized criminal threats, the Vasquez case remained the most significant and influential investigation of his professional life. The case had taught him that effective law enforcement required not just technical skills and investigative techniques, but also international cooperation, industry partnerships, and a deep understanding of the criminal methodologies that threatened major economic and social institutions. The Vasquez case changed everything about how I understood my role as a police officer, Lieutenant Rodriguez reflected during his retirement ceremony. It taught me that protecting and serving meant more than responding to individual crimes. It meant understanding and disrupting the criminal networks that threatened entire communities and economic systems. The Las Vegas Metro Police Department's response to the casino heist conspiracy had become a model for how law enforcement agencies could evolve and adapt to address sophisticated international criminal operations while maintaining community trust and industry cooperation. The case had demonstrated that effective policing required not just law enforcement expertise, but also collaboration with diverse partners who brought different perspectives and resources to complex security challenges. The lights of the Strip continued to attract millions of visitors from around the world, but now they also illuminated one of the most sophisticated security networks ever developed to protect a major tourism destination. The night shift officers who patrolled Las Vegas understood that they were guardians of more than individual safety. They were protecting the economic and social infrastructure that supported entire communities while serving as a model for security innovation that influenced protective measures throughout the world. The case that had begun with one officer's careful observation in a parking garage had evolved into a transformation of casino security that protected not just Las Vegas, but gambling facilities and tourism destinations throughout the world. The professional criminals who had once seen major casinos as vulnerable targets now faced security measures and law enforcement capabilities that had been enhanced by the lessons learned from Elena Vasquez and her network of sophisticated operatives. The eternal rhythm of Las Vegas continued. Tourists arriving and departing, games of chance creating winners and losers, entertainment providing escape from everyday concerns. But beneath the glittering surface, a comprehensive security network maintained constant vigilance against the sophisticated criminal organizations that viewed the city's wealth and international prominence as opportunities for exploitation. For the men and women who chose to work the night shift in one of America's most unique and challenging law enforcement environments, the Vasquez case served as a permanent reminder that routine patrol work could intersect with international criminal operations, and that their vigilance and professionalism were essential components of a security system that protected not just individual visitors, but the economic and social foundations of their community. The night shift never ended in Las Vegas, and neither did the commitment to protecting the millions of people who trusted that the city's glamour and excitement could be enjoyed safely. The officers who maintained that protection understood that they were part of a tradition that had transformed criminal threats into enhanced security, creating a model that influenced law enforcement and security practices throughout the world.